This is the April 16th study session of Littleton City Council. And we have, April 10th. Rushing through it with glasses. And so this evening we have 3 items on the agenda. Our first item is a conversation with Kendrick Keast, who will be assisting us on the community visioning process. And so, Jocelyn, do you want to get started on this?
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Get that started. So yes, to repeat what the mayor just said, this is to get us the conversation started about the vision, the comprehensive plan process. After that, we're going to turn it over to Henry and Keith to introduce themselves and give you a little bit of intro. And then really it's about having a conversation and a dialogue, getting input from council and mayor. So, with that.
Thank you. We appreciate all the references to conversation because that's what we were looking for tonight. Purposely did not prepare any slides, just wanted to talk tonight very informally. I'll tell you a little bit about our firm and then ourselves, introduce ourselves. We'll talk about the process ahead and maybe some of our philosophy along the way. We want to make sure we leave plenty of time for your questions so we're not talking to you this entire time. But very quickly, Kendrick Keast Collaborative, we're based in the Houston area, but we work around the country. We worked in 37 states since we were founded in 1982. I made a quick list of the Colorado experience. We worked in Aspen, Cortez, Durango, Winter Park, so some of the more western cities, but about 10 years ago, we helped Centennial with their land development regulations, so worked on that process. We'll be working with the City of Westminster here shortly on a similar process, and part of a team working with the City of Denver on some of their zoning issues. So we'll be in the area, but as far as vision processes, in some cases we work through a process like this where it's ahead of updating the comprehensive plan. In other places, it's kind of weaved into that process for time and budget reasons, but I like these processes, the chance to have that broader conversation first. As far as I'm concerned, we're starting the comprehensive plan process tonight. The vision process is part of that process, but it sets us up well to get into the details in terms of what data, what information do we need to focus on, what are the issues on the table, the constituencies that we need to reach in even more detail during the comprehensive plan process. So that's part of our focus there. Let me introduce myself. I'm approaching about 30 years now working in community planning. So I started out working with a county just north of New York City in the Hudson River Valley. It was about a third public land, a very strong growth management county, but it was booming at the time. So it was that balance of a lot of development, but a lot of interest in preserving what that area had always been historically. So I've worked with cities from 500 people to over 200,000, so kind of that range. Meredith and I actually have the same background. We worked for our Council of Governments in the Houston area before getting into consulting, so the equivalent of the Denver Regional COG. And so that's some of my background. We'll talk more along the way.
What's your name?
Oh, I'm sorry, Gary Mitchell. I thought it might have been mentioned at the beginning. Gary Mitchell, yes.
And my name is Meredith Dang, and I'm a senior associate. Gary's very modest. He's the president of Kendrick East, which I don't know if you mentioned. I have 13 years of experience as a professional planner, and I started my career as a city planner in a community in the Houston area that's about the same size as the city of Littleton, that was experiencing some interesting issues related to resiliency. A hurricane hit within my first month of being on that island city, the city of Galveston, if any of y'all have been down that way. Then I spent about a decade working for the Regional Council of Government, where I led the agency's Livable Centers program, which was a program that we started to work with local communities that were interested in creating places to live, work, and play. I was also involved in our regional visioning efforts, and again, working with a range of communities from very rural to very urban.
All right, so we are just getting started on this process. We'll be here for the next 2 days. After this session tonight, we're meeting with Planning Commission in the morning. Then we'll be meeting with the department directors part of the day tomorrow, doing some touring with staff, and then we have a series of meetings with different groups in the community to, again, start the conversation. We frankly are easing into this. We want to get familiar with the landscape, with the people that are in the discussion, and go from there. We'll be doing this work through the fall, reporting back to council by the end of the year. This, as you have discussed in your previous preparation to get to this step, this is intended to lead to comprehensive plan update, transportation master plan, and potentially updating the city's development regulations based on all this. So that is the path ahead. We will be working with staff on the specifics of the timeline, the activities in the months ahead, but we will be here multiple times in the months ahead. And really, this is a partnership between us and staff, so when we're not here on the ground doing things, staff will be doing things as well, whether it's online engagement. We've talked about a speaker series, things that will be happening along the way. We want to plan our trips here to coincide with other things that are happening in the community so we can build on those. If there's anything I've learned, especially in the last 5 to 10 years, the challenges of public engagement, attention divided many other ways, trying to get people to come to events, but we need to go to where people are. We need to go to them and have those discussions. So some other principles for us in this process, along with definitely a partnership with staff, is just we use the word inclusive. At the end of the day, what that means is who have we not reached? We're going to be constantly looking at whether it's geographically, demographics, who have we not reached, what can we do along the way? So there is an aspect of adjusting as we go, as we work through this in the months ahead to make sure we're reaching. We are not starting from scratch. We know that a process was done in 2014, previous plans. In the months leading up to this and working with staff, we have read pretty much every document of recent years that involves planning or projects. That is our starting point. Yes, we're going to step back and see where we are today. That's part of our interest. What's changed in just the last few years? At the end of the day, I look at these, this ends up as words on paper, very frankly, just as in the 2014 document. And those words are very important. And I don't want to get into those weeds tonight, but how you put those words on paper is very important. When we look back at the 2014 document, for example, as outsiders, there's some things we're not sure about. That statement on paper needs to be very clear on what the meaning is and what it implies. So that'll be part of our role in this as well. We will get to the end of this process. We always do. My favorite city engineer quote is the old sausage-making cliche that I never thought we'd get to this day, but here we are. It's interesting along the way usually, but we will get there. I started to talk about a vision statement, the mechanics of it. One way I describe it is if you, for some reason, went away for 20 years, the Rip Van Winkle situation, and came back and drove into your community, what would you see in that image? What's the same? What's different? And that's part of what we need to capture on paper. The other part is we hear the word values. The example I mentioned to staff today is most everywhere we work, people can agree that they want a safe community. Well, we had that discussion elsewhere recently, and safe to one person meant security cameras all around the city, which had some folks really concerned from a privacy standpoint. To other people, it meant bicycle pedestrian safety, crossing streets. That's safety. To someone else, it meant, I really don't want to have a lot of community events because that brings outsiders. So just a lot of different ways of approaching just the theme of safety. So those are the kind of discussions we need to have. And as I say, we are looking ahead to the comprehensive plan, but we're looking at some big picture issues and where the commonalities are among your residents, recognizing that people come from all different perspectives, again, from where they live in the community to their backgrounds, what they do day to day. So we have to account for all that too. The final thing I'll say before we turn over to you, when I start into a project like this and I'm looking to figure out a community's values, I look at the city budget, the old thing about you put your money where your mouth is. I look at the visitor's guide. This is what you're telling the outside world and potential visitors about what's special about this place and where to spend your time. We also look at your community organizations, your nonprofits, which are some of the people we're going to be meeting with the next few days. That says a lot about where people put their volunteer time. What are the issues that you're needing to address that city government can't alone address? And ultimately, we look at visions and plans that are on paper. So that's where we need to be in a year or two after these processes. So I think I'll stop there, Mayor, and open up for your questions. We want to give you that time tonight.
Council, any questions? Jerry?
So Jocelyn, you're going to share that box of plans for them to review?
Oh, they've been reading, Jerry.
Cool, so that is the plans you're talking about? Okay, cool, all right.
And it is a big box.
Lucky you.
It is a big place.
All right. That's-
Karina? Go ahead, Warren.
Reading through the proposal and the process, a couple of things, and you mentioned it as well just now, where a vision becomes words on paper. And I think, so I'm glad to get confirmation that there is, because in here it talked about outcomes, a framework, and I just want it to be much more tangible than just a framework. It's like we will have a vision statement, we will have a vision document, but more importantly is how does that live on?
Yes.
So it's not just about putting it on paper, even if you can come back 20 years from now and still understand it. What's important is how we live it, breathe it, engage with it on everything that we do. That's how you keep it alive. That's how you keep it current, relevant, and understood over time. So I just want to make sure that that element is not just an assumption, but also built into your process and your deliverable to us. Of it's not just celebrating. I think in one of these you talked about a big kind of celebration of it being done, but to me it's not ever necessarily done, but it's a living, breathing thing that we continue to talk about. It's not a one-time event that we talk about it.
Absolutely. It's done at a point in time,
Yeah.
and you should be constantly revisiting it annually through your budget process, council retreats. That may be from the overview of the process that was available. I'm not sure if that was on paper, but part of our thinking is this vision process feeds into the comprehensive plan process to test those words on paper. when we get into the nitty-gritty of a future land use plan, of capital improvement decisions, of housing, parks, down the list, transportation.
But I would like to see some recommendations, not, because even the comp plan, then we're done with the comp plan, so yes, it contributes, or not contributes, it leads the development of those plans, but I almost want to talk about it more broadly in a communication strategy of how do we as council, when we talk at our council meetings, when we're giving our, making our decisions, how do we always kind of circle back to the basis of my decision is as the vision statement, and so it's give us some coaching, give us some recommendations, not just council, but staff, and even our citizens, so it begins to stick for everyone, and everyone feels comfortable and confident when they talk about Littleton. Littleton is, our vision is.
We took a quick peek in the council chamber, but number one is it should be on the wall. My favorite city I dealt with during the council meeting, the members of the dais were turning around constantly pointing to vision statement, goals, policy statements that are on the wall. But where I was headed was on the comprehensive plan, at the end of that plan, the implementation, it needs to tie these words on paper to your decision-making processes. Capital improvements program, annual budget, all these ways that you make decisions, your development review procedures, all these things. That's how it becomes real.
Just looking for very tangible recommendations.
Carol?
Did you folks write the proposed scope overview that we were looking at?
That was kind of a joint effort between us and staff, and it was to kind of start the discussion among us of how to frame this process. So I look at it as kind of a starting point of where we started this discussion. But specific questions about it?
I would comment that, and as I did to Jocelyn already, there are a number of terms, and I wrote an email to Jocelyn with those, that I don't know what they mean. And well, starting with vision, the word vision, I don't know what that, I know what I think it means, but I bet like you're talking about other people. But vision isn't the only one. There are a lot of phrases in here that if we don't get them defined, we're going to get results that we didn't expect, because other people are going to interpret them all kinds of different ways.
I think that kind of started as a discussion starter and ended up being a handout. So it was, not with that thought in mind of maybe the broader audience. One thing I meant to mention earlier, if I can follow up on your point, one thing I encounter often in these types of projects is vision versus mission, especially in the business world. But organizations in general have mission statements. That's the purposes that organization is trying to accomplish, which may be working toward a vision for that business, that industry. With a community, first of all, because I've been asked the question, who are the stakeholders? Everybody's a stakeholder. And we will not reach everybody, I guarantee you. We will give them the opportunities, but part of that audience too are people that come here during the day that don't live here. They are stakeholders too. Your neighboring communities are stakeholders that things go well in this part of the region. But I want to get that out there too, that a mission statement is more driving an organization. A vision is how we all share in an endpoint we're trying to get to. The comprehensive plan then talk about terminology. We get to goals and other statements that you're trying to work toward. At the end of the day, it's actions. How do you do things to get to those endpoints? So,
Peggy?
Now, I've got a whole bunch of sticky marks on my document, so can I go through all of them, or?
Are they questions that you have?
Yeah. So, and suggestion. This relates to communication, so I suggest that we, you or somebody, video the outreach activities where input's gathered and then show it on videos on our city channel, post them online for people to watch on demand, encourage teachers to have their students watch them and come in as a class and or individually, because we want, I don't know whether first graders, but they can have some pretty interesting thoughts, but whoever that might have thoughts.
if I could speak to these along the way.
Okay.
I was going to say, we Worked with very small kids recently on a project, and we want a roller coaster in our neighborhood. That was the number one consensus, so you talk about what that means. But yes,
Love it.
they are very open-minded about the future.
Then I wondered how we can ensure that the small groups are a representative sample of the community, including parents with young children, people who work evening, people who work night shifts, and are very diverse northeast neighborhood. We have, 57 languages spoken in our public schools. I mean, at home.
And they all need to learn English.
Yeah, well, and they're working on it, but, I mean, so the parents and grandparents may not have good interface because they haven't mastered the language so well. Just got that one.
Part of the discussions we'll be having over the next few days with some of the groups that Jocelyn has set up for us, we'll be having those discussions about what is the best way to reach these groups that don't traditionally participate in the processes for various reasons. So the people that do work with them, what's the best way? And it's going to be different methods for different groups. So having those discussions early.
And for some of it, it's different areas will have different methods. Many churches have very active, diverse congregations, so that sort of responds to that part. Then I'm looking at the bottom of page 3. In addition to benchmarking, couldn't this information be used to stimulate thinking beyond the information gathering stage? So you gather something, but it then becomes useful in a next level of discussion or questioning or
Absolutely, and that was my point too about this is all feeding into the comprehensive plan.
and I imagine you already are way ahead of me on this, but I'm on page 4 now. Why not utilize nextdoor.com in conjunction with neighborhood meetings to give more people the opportunity to express views? Because if they're homebound or the only opportunity they have is at 3 in the morning when they can't sleep, and they, or some people are working swing shifts, night shifts. And again, using some of what I already said before. Let's see. Then I had a question about why we're so concerned, or seem to be primarily concerned with the daytime population. Why not also the evening and weekend population that we attract? And sometimes it's pretty exciting population here. Sometimes more exciting than we necessarily are happy about. Then I'm on page 6 with a page about creating economic parameters and confirming the economic sustainability of the comprehensive plan. I'm wondering, how is it possible to ensure literally do that, economic sustainability? Every city goes through cycles, and Littleton, because it's landlocked, is probably more challenged than some. Then the economic parameters that are below on that page will surely change in less than 22 years. I mean, I think significantly, just as they have since I was first elected almost 11 years ago. So that, and we've seen industries, we've seen Martin Marietta, Lockheed Martin, go through ups and downs depending on what was happening with the federal government. And I don't think I said this way, but will there be necessarily growth in a landlocked city if we preserve what the citizens say they love? At least the majority of citizens say they love. So, and if some of us older folks keep outlasting the projection, then it makes it more difficult, as I think I already said. I think that's all. So, but I mean, this is all good stuff. I'm just stirring you up a bit.
Yes, absolutely. These are all good observations. We appreciate it.
Kyle?
I think Peggy took some of what I was going to ask about ensuring, well, I think Littleton and pretty much every city everywhere has a challenge in getting representative input from the community. What has been a interesting or novel or unique approach that you took somewhere else that either worked or didn't work to try to reach out to a population that isn't normally involved in these processes?
One recent well, give a couple examples. One thing that I believe is in the material is the idea of living room sessions. We learned that we can have a neighborhood meeting, we can meet at a local church, we can meet at a school. We literally had to go to people's homes and have them invite their neighbors, and we never saw those people. Later in the process, they will not come to a traditional public meeting. So just the looking for ways to literally get to people where they are, if it's in the evening, if it's on the weekend. The language item, as you mentioned, Councilmember Cole, is often it is working through the younger generations and trying to get materials to home or to get parents to come to an event and have them be the bridge. And we've done, you name it, the art contest, the things that lead to a bicycle prize or things that bring the kids to something. When we do public events, we like to have some type of an entertainment aspect to it, which can be a school choir, because all the parents come, the ones that can, with their schedules. And so it's going to workplaces. We do more than ever. In other words, pizza lunches at a local, one of your larger employers, for example. Same thing, people that, and you mentioned shift workers and people that only have certain availability. I think I mentioned 30 years of doing this. You know, we started out at a time where you just put up a sign and went to the school cafeteria and people came out like crazy. You've got to go to where people are. It's got to be meaningful. You need to capture what people are telling you systematically and be able to report that back to you, and that people can see the flow from what they said to what ends up those words on paper. Those are some examples. Yes, absolutely.
So we were doing a plan in a community that was having a lot of struggles, high unemployment rate, very underbanked community, high immigrant population, and we were doing a plan that was about pedestrian infrastructure, and that was not high on their list of priorities for the community. So we worked with local community organizations, and we had essentially a job fair. So we had it in a makerspace, which is an industrial workshop where people in the community can go and learn skills, and they got to tour the makerspace. Sarah Jobs for Progress, which was a local nonprofit, was there to talk about their job training. We had someone from a local community bank that was doing some innovative banking initiatives for underbanked communities. And then, oh, by the way, we're going to get some input on these pedestrian projects. So we had over 100 people come out to this meeting, and these are people who probably had never been to a traditional public meeting. And we had the local bakery supply food that had been made in the equivalent of a makerspace, but for culinary efforts. And it was just a real great way to bring the community together. And I don't think we would have gotten that turnout if we said, hey, come talk to us about sidewalks. So I think it's finding out what's important to that community, and the partnerships and the people that they already trust in the community, and just being open to doing things a little bit outside the box.
Did somebody have a question?
I do have
Jerry.
more. So we have hired people, added staff, done a lot of things to get our comp plan accomplished, and have not gotten there yet. Give me some of your background on dealing with cities like that.
My experience is it's usually change in leadership, which can lead to change in staff, which causes those drop-offs in a study or a plan was done, and then things didn't continue from there. I'm very much aware that there is a 2014 document, and there are other studies. If I haven't said it already, we're also very much aware whenever we do this type of work, the world does not stop. You have corridor studies, you have different projects going on, those continue. Part of our challenge is to see how those fit into the current conversation we're having. Is it a different conversation from where you were just a few years ago? Are things coming up through the public engagement for some of those projects that are new or conflicting potentially? All these different signals and ways to see where the community is today and how it may be changing, evolving. At the end of the day, I'm trying to think of some specific examples, Councilmember, but that's what strikes me is that usually it's not the document, it's the players that it just didn't continue for whatever
Right, and
reason.
that's, you've described what has happened to us. What have you had experience with localities like that?
Definitely kind of being in this role, coming in after the fact, not so much working on a project that then sat. I mean, most of our work does get to the adoption point, so I'm thinking more of examples where we're in this role, where a few years down the road, and sometimes it's because a city is just changing so quickly, rapid growth, that we come in a few years later, but again, change in leadership, there's some reason why we're revisiting a plan from just a few years ago and not starting from scratch.
Karina?
Did you know I had more questions?
You see it in my eyes? You had that look, yeah.
I'm going to touch a little bit on what was mentioned, but so I do want to come back to the discussion of economic sustainability of this plan. And we can develop a vision and a comp plan, but then it's just not realistically, or it's not economically sustainable. So how are you going to work through that? And I think just kind of testing it every now and then, that doesn't give me that confidence, because every decision that we make, every want has an implication. So our choices may be different if we knew what the cost was. So if you could talk about that a little bit. The second item was your comment of the flow of what people say and how it ends up on paper. So one of the reasons that some of these documents that we have done end up sitting, or we're not adopting them, because there has been a lot of pushback saying, well, that's not what I said. So I think that is a very important part here. We're undertaking a really big, comprehensive project that we do not want to get to the end and someone say, that's not what I said, or my ideas weren't incorporated. Now the point is, of course, not everybody's ideas make the final cut, but that, I call it a traceability matrix, where it's, here were the requirements or the comments, et cetera, and here's, what we did with that, and what made it to the final one, what didn't, and the reasons why it did not. And then the third is, as you mentioned, things don't stop. There's a Bellevue corridor study. There's other things. We have meet and greets going on throughout the summer. So I'm concerned, or I just want to make sure that we're not, every week there's not something else that we're asking citizens to go to. So the things that we already have on the calendar, to your point, it's like you're there for something else. Oh, by the way, since you're here for this, let me ask you about X, Y, and Z. So just, kind of restating, let's use some of the avenues that we have, but please, 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 let's find some new avenues that we haven't tapped into and we know are underrepresented.
Carol?
Well, then he's going to answer my questions.
Oh, I'm sorry.
On the cost item, I wanted to, in a
We
second.
didn't know that was a question.
Well, comment on my observation.
Reminds me of somebody else.
Comment on my observation.
Second, I want to have Meredith talk about a neighbor city nearby, Golden.
Okay.
entire situation. On the cost question, my background's in economics, and in a recent project, we very much talked about that these processes can turn into a wish list process, and we can do all these wonderful things. So I talked very much in every step of that process about needs versus wants. We need to deal with needs first. What is needed in terms of whether it's police issues, staffing, whatever, from infrastructure needs, those kind of things, to wants, the ones that are things we'd like to have. At the end of the day, I look at these vision statements and plans as what are the things that are just right? We like it. Don't mess with that. How do we strengthen it? How do we maintain it? And what are the things that need some work? They need attention, need to change. And maybe a third one is what's not here. That tends to be the wish list stuff. What do we not have that that community over there has that? I wish we had that. Well, what does it cost? How did they get there? So those discussions. Let me have Meredith talk about the Golden example because that's the cost issue.
Sure. We know that Golden undertook a visioning process that we looked at as part of our background work. We know that you all are familiar with that vision process as well. So in that research, we saw that they're very recently undertaking an update to that vision based on the fact that they realized that they can't fund everything that that vision entails. They said, we found out we want to do all these things through this great process, all the values that Golden has, but it would cost us tens of millions of dollars that we don't have. So now they're going back through a process and having those discussions about, okay, knowing these are our values, what are the priorities, what are the give and takes if we can't have all of this all at once. So I think in this process, it'll be important for us to have those discussions as we go so that in the end, we'll have an outcome that we've already worked through some of those needs and wants, as Gary said.
Council member, I thought of an example. We got involved in, it was a downtown vision process, but they had been through multiple iterations of doing downtown plans and vision statements, and nothing happened. There was lack of consensus. They thought they had some words on paper that everybody had agreed to, but when it came down to getting something done, everybody went off on their different tangents. So we used a traffic signal motif when we got there. Let's separate out the things that are green light. Everybody says we need to do that tomorrow. Let's get it done. The yellow category was we think we're there. We need to work through some issues. Red was forget about it. Just put it aside. You're not going to agree on this. Those were the things that were holding up the yellows and the greens for years. So I think that can be part of the conversation. I bring that up because we try to capture all the input we get. That's appendix material, or it's somewhere accessible after these processes. But that was a way that we said, here was the discussion on the red light item. It's captured, but at the end of the day, we're not going there. And the big red light issue there was putting a street through in the downtown area. They had fought over it for years. Just leave it alone. It's just not going to be resolved. So to try and focus time and energy on things that can get done. So I guess the third point was, the term of the day is meeting fatigue. We absolutely come into processes where there's been corridor plans, special area plans, other studies going on, and people are just worn out from officials to staff to your community. Plus, when you're a community, like I say, that has so many neat events during the year, and people can only divide their time so many ways, plus people that only have certain time because of their job commitments. So we're very much aware of that. That's part of the going to where people are and when they can provide input, plus the online component, so it's on their time and convenience.
Peggy?
So two things. I hope I got these right in my head. I scribbled as you were talking. So needs first, then wants, right? The needs with a clear reason why this is needed and has this higher priority. Then the wonderful wants needed, if possible. Is that?
Yes, and that debate continues in the process because you run into, well, I want it, so obviously we all need it. So it's working through those conversations that
Yeah,
What's good for me is, what's good for GM is good for everybody.
And then the funding stuff. So some of that then sorts itself out. Here's the $40 million thing. Just in case somebody leaves us some money, we can do that. But if we can't do it, then it's just there. But let's be realistic.
Well, and this ties back to Councilmember Valdez's point that we've come in after the fact in communities where it's usually deferred infrastructure work. The 40 million item is a absolute need to the point of maybe being under a consent order from the state that you have got to fix this. And it's always been that, well, it's 40 million, we can't deal with that. Well, guess what? You better start chipping away at it and doing the 2 million and the 6 million things to get to that 40 million before it becomes 80 million and worse. So I hear what you're saying. It depends on what those $40 million items are. And there's people that want the $40 million skate park, and there's people that say this is what we can afford at this point in time, and we can build on it over time. But yes, it's at the end of the comprehensive plan process when there's specific action items on the table, there's got to be a rational sequence of, from a money standpoint, from who's the lead actor, that somebody can get it done, are their partners, and some criteria of urgency. Is it an absolute public safety item versus a desire?
Any other questions? I have a couple. You had mentioned that council would be seeing a report in the fall. Will there be any updates along the way?
Yes, and that is part of the partnership as well, that you'll be hearing from staff along the way, but when we're here, we'll try and time that so that we can, whether it's at this meeting or a way to keep you in the loop along the way.
And I guess just a request then with staff, and is that there be, if we could timeline out those updates so that we have an idea of when they'll be coming, coordinate so that with scheduling and stuff, so it's not something any of us miss, and then also that the public has the opportunity to be prepared for when those are, when we're hearing those. Then what do you see as the role of the Planning Commission in this process?
In the vision process, I don't want to say we downplay their role, but they're one of the groups that we need to have the community conversation with. They bring us certain insight from their role in reviewing development. Their role is more important, frankly, in the comprehensive plan stage. So I think it's partly preparing them. I know there's some new membership is part of the mix too. So I kind of see the vision process as another way of gearing up and the Planning Commission for the.
What do you see as their role in the comprehensive? So go past the visioning, and then when you do start working on it.
That's a discussion item we need to have for the comprehensive plan process. Is in some communities we work directly with the Planning Commission. Sometimes that becomes an advisory committee with additional members, but with the Planning Commission as the core. So those kind of models. But this might be a situation where it's very much the Planning Commission that's involved, and I think that's the history of previous plans that were done. So, but I think that's a discussion to continue.
Right.
And if I can add one more point, at the end of the day, and this ties back to the comments about maybe previous plans not carrying forward, of anybody, the Planning Commission are the ones that should be taking that plan forward once it's adopted. I don't know about maybe city charter or those kind of provisions here, but in many cities, the Planning Commission is charged with reporting to council, reporting to the community on progress and status. And so that will, in plans that we work on, that is our message at the end of the day, is the Planning Commission is the keepers of that document.
Okay, great. I don't have any other questions. Mark, you got a couple comments?
Yeah, just a couple of comments, and maybe even to follow up, Mayor, on your question about kind of the comp plan and the Planning Commission, their role. The way this contract has been structured here is we've kind of identified the three major pieces: the vision, the comp plan, and then the code updates. And so they've been given the notice to proceed here with the budget, of course, that matches up to the vision. As we move down this process here, we'll provide council with an update and look for the next opportunity to define the steps for the comp plan. And so you'll have an opportunity to kind of weigh in on that scope, again, with that history of where we've been now through part of the visioning process. So if the council is comfortable with that, and you budget, of course, the next phase of that, then they'll be given the notice to proceed for that second phase, and then so on for the third phase. So, just a couple of questions here, or maybe points to make. I think the council had a great discussion at your retreat, your workshop here in early February, and obviously you identified this as one of your imperatives. And so we did go through a process here to kind of move this forward quickly here. It was a procurement process, formally recognized, something we've done certainly in the past, and we are very pleased to pick Kendrick East for this. So it is a little unusual about how we got to this point in time, but in essence, to really start that work as soon as we could. That's the message we got, of course, from the council. And I think you're starting to see a little bit of why we, as staff, selected them for this particular task. Their experience in the citizen engagement is broad, unique. So they certainly have the experience to kind of reach out into a community here in ways that we have struggled with, quite honestly. And so we are looking for somebody who is innovative to do this differently. And you certainly have heard me say before, having been through these processes, it's all about the public process. We do that well, and I'm confident we'll get to the end here. So that's one of the reasons why. Another reason, I think, is they have some very unique talents, expertise, that we didn't necessarily get to touch on here, but I think over time you'll probably see that. One is community character. And so their firm, quite honestly, is known for that issue. And so I think that we'll be able to explore that. We don't have to do that now, but their approach to that is deep. And I think that's another reason why staff was very pleased, to see that in that collective experience. And the last thing, quite honestly, from my perspective, is they've done a lot of work nationwide in communities similar to us. And you've heard that. They have stepped in after the fact to get to the end. And we've had a lot of conversation here, of course, with council about that. So personally, I think this is a great kickoff. It is exciting for this community. I truly believe this is probably one of the more important things that our community could take on. As we look at the changes that go on in the whole metro area, the Front Range, we must be prepared for change. And in my opinion, this is it. This is the opportunity for us to define that.
Peggy?
So I have a question. Did you all do a drive around?
We have done some driving. We got here midday today. We are going to do extensive driving with staff. And we will be driving every time we are here. We like to see.
Well, yeah, but before you
Yes.
go,
Right.
I'd be really curious to have a very honest statement of what you see as our current character.
Can't say that today.
I
don't know.
No.
Good.
That's why
I want to
I
make
asked
sure I didn't
you.
have to say it tonight.
Were you fairly familiar with us? Because I think you are what you are able to give us this impression, not having theoretically been prejudiced by anything, but taking when we don't have a traffic jam, right? So.
I'll give you
Early morning hours, like 3 a.m.
Yeah.
I'll give you a preview, because we talked, Meredith and I, doing some initial driving today. The one thing that I didn't expect, should have known that history, is the amount of multifamily from the 60s, 70s period that's in the city. And I kind of discussed some of the economics of that, of some of the larger companies that were here and when employees came here and maybe how that progressed. But, thinking of this as maybe more of a suburban community, but it has a different development path maybe than some cities follow. So you see that on the ground.
Maybe you don't know. We started out as a fun community.
Oh, absolutely.
With cows and shift the milk up to Denver. Then we discovered we could be more, so.
Yes, and others discovering they could be more here, coming here, and here we are. If I could end with this item, we tried to learn a little bit about council in preparing, and my favorite council members have always been English teachers. So, so my point is, I need to know now, Oxford comma in or out?
No, but I will tell you, I caught a spelling error. I'll show you in a minute.
Peggy, that's not a
The word's spelled correctly, but it's not the right word, so, I mean, it's not spelled.
Was it area and R?
Yeah.
I caught it. English is my second language, actually. And I'm an English teacher, too.
And I'm just to get it done, get it done,
Get her done.
get it done.
That's English.
Thank you very much. We appreciate
Another
your
language.
being here and looking forward to working together with you for the next year and a half plus on this. So, well, thank you very much. And we'll go ahead and I think we'll do like a 5-minute break while the other presentation gets set up. On our agenda is a presentation on the homeless impact along the South Platte River. And this was a presentation that was brought to the South Platte Working Group. And we saw this presentation and it was stunning because it's our neighbors to the north. And it was an impressive presentation in so much as there was a opportunity to actually maybe have some action that could be taken. And I know that the cities of Sheridan and Englewood are dealing with this. And so I wanted to have this presentation brought to council. While we may not be seeing the same type of activity along the Platte River that Englewood and Sheridan are seeing, we are seeing this activity in the city of Littleton. We do have some examples of that. And I think we just need to get an idea on what really is happening out there. What are the things that we may need to spend some more time and attention on? What are some things that we aren't doing right? What are we doing right? So it's a big conversation. It's a large discussion. And as the city manager has indicated, the county is looking at putting together a large homeless summit for the southern region, and this would all be included part and parcel of that. But what we have also determined that the Tri-Cities, we have an obligation and a responsibility, particularly to our river corridor, and that does tend to be where a lot of these activities start to happen. And so this is a great opportunity for us to get kind of an education on what's happening, ask some questions. We are not looking for an answer tonight. We are just beginning our informational journey through this in the hopes that at some point we may be able to do some things that can help solve this problem at some level. So we're going to have a number of presenters tonight. First is Officer Reed McGrath. He's a sergeant with the Englewood Police Department. So
thank you, Mayor
there you go.
and Council. I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you and tell you what happened in our city, and we can talk a little bit about what's going on currently. But the first question, and I think it's an important question, is how did we get here? Because you're going to see this, you're going to go, oh my gosh. And how we got here is we don't have some of the things in place that you do in the city of Littleton, particularly dealing with the Platte River. So the Platte River, as it goes to the city of Littleton, is completely under the jurisdiction of the Colorado Water Conservation Board, amongst, I'm not sure how many other entities, but they're involved in that. And then there's also the chunk of South Suburban Parks that plays into that. We became aware we had a problem, and a growing problem in the area of Dartmouth and Platte area. One concern there is our shared wastewater treatment facility has output just down the river from there, and we get tested on that frequently. So that was a very, very living concern of theirs, that all the trash and the waste was going to affect that, and we were going to get fined for that. So that was one concern. There were safety concerns. There was a homicide just inside Denver along the riverbanks in the area that we're looking at. There was another one in the city of Englewood associated with that. And but we just became more and more aware we have a problem here. As I went down there and began to look, it was like you were looking at a third world situation. It was so bad. And I began to explore, how do we deal with this? And the first question is, who owns the area? And to this day, we still don't know who owns that property. So I can't trespass people off that property if I don't know who owns it. It's just a basic fact of life. It's not a park. There's no park hours that play into other factors. Like I'm sure all your parks in Littleton South Suburban, they have curfews at 11 o'clock at night. everybody's out of the park, and the police officers at 2, 3 in the morning, if there's going to be somebody in the park, they're going to remove them, and they have the lawful authority to do that. So we didn't have that. We looked everywhere. Basically, we got together, a couple of us, Steve Meterkowski got in this really early from Joe Busto with Colorado Water Conservation Board, and we set a group together, and we started meeting and saying, how do we deal with this issue? And Andy was one of the first meeting. Sergeant Campman from Littleton's been to one of our meetings. Denver's been invited to every single one of our meetings and has had some attendance in that. We're really interested in looking at this from a regional perspective too. This was our problem. It's solved for the moment there, but it's just moved elsewhere. We have a tremendous homeless problem going on in Inglewood. We have calls for service throughout the day. I was in our dispatch center before I came here, and they handed me yet another complaint. And some of the people that probably we moved from the river have moved along the sound barrier walls along Santa Fe. So, lots of people involved in this. We got All Health Network involved in this. And local nonprofit groups, local ministries, churches, all came along with us when we began this project. So this area that we're looking at right here is basically where you see the first red arrow is our first camp.
An engineer.
I'm not an electrical engineer.
Thanks for trying, Mark.
So our first camp is up here. It's Camp A. We located all these camps. We did GPS coordinates on them because we were keenly aware that if we took any property from them of value, we were going to have to store that for a period of time and have the ability to give that back to anybody we identified at these camps. Camp A, we actually made an arrest out of there for a female who had a felony warrant. That was our only arrest during this process. Our goal was not to go in and arrest people. Our goal was voluntary compliance and getting things to work so that urban drainage and flood control could come in. They identified this area as needing much remediation. In the 25 years I've been in Inglewood, the river pretty much hasn't been touched. It's heavy, heavy, heavy vegetation. It's down trees. It's just a mess. And you'll see a little bit of that. And Steve will talk a little bit more about that and why that's important. That was one way we could get in here and actually do this. We had our city manager declare this a public nuisance. And we had urban drainage flood control say we have got to get in there and do work. To do the work, we've got to move people out and we've got to clean up the trash.
And move them out to where?
I'm sorry, who asked?
Well, I'm sorry, yeah, it was a habit.
We came in with these resources from Severe Weather Shelter Network that operates here in Littleton and also in Inglewood. We brought the All Health Network in and other resources so that we could try to find alternate locations for people, from shelters to whatever they want to do. Quite a few people who live down here were really not interested in doing anything other than living along the river. Some of them moved into Denver, at least temporarily. Others moved into other parts of our city. But since we had to get in there and do the work, they had to move.
So we don't know where they really moved to.
They went, we know one person went to a shelter for certain, and we know that quite a few others just kind of dispersed out into our neighboring areas. Once we did this sweep, we started getting calls for service close by in an area that is right down here toward the bottom of the map. There's a road down here called Rob Roy Road that they moved into. So this just gives you an idea of the camps. We had 21 camps here. We identified about 31 people associated with the camps. This is the posting notice that we did from the city manager. We gave them to anybody that we came in contact with there. We posted them at various campsites and along the river. And not only was it directed to people living there, but basically we shut the whole river down for a couple of weeks so Steve and his crew could come in and do the remediation that was necessary. After we posted the camps, these are pictures of the trash that was left. In this picture, you can see some hypodermic syringes from drug use, most likely. Massive amounts of trash, garbage, food, graffiti issues. These are campsites that were abandoned here and just left. I think this one in the middle is about the worst that we have, just deplorable living conditions for people to try to live in. This is actually a tent over here. Sometimes it's kind of hard to tell because everything kind of flows, but there's a tent that someone was living in. And then we had the human waste issues. We had buckets. We had just a mess of human waste all through this area that we had to deal with, and it was really concerning to everybody involved. When we did the cleanup, this is what it looked like. This isn't the best picture to show you what Steve and his people did. This more shows what the trash did. Our Parks Department cleaned out the vast majority of the trash, freeing up the money from urban drainage and flood control to actually do the vegetation remediation. And I'll show you a slide on some costs at the end. This shows a little better picture of some of the vegetation remediation that was done through the area. And this is what this area looks like afterwards in some of the places. This gives you an overall picture. I'm not sure how to get this thing to play on this computer. Here it is.
It says media on it.
Okay. This is just a drone flight down the river that shows the cleanup, and for some of our audience, we wanted to see how we could potentially change this into an activation area where the river's used and accessible by other people, potentially put a bike trail in there. That's kind of one of our ultimate dreams, is that we improve it so that it's usable by multiple groups of people. The cost of this project, the vast majority of it came from urban drainage and flood control, went to a private company called Arbor Force at $29,000 to do vegetation remediation. But as you can see, about $10,000 of that. A lot of it was in-kind money from parks. I don't have the figures in here for police department. I didn't calculate what our costs were because this is kind of what we do, but parks outside the bounds of their normal duties. That's the presentation I have. And I don't know if you want to address questions to me or if you want to hear everybody else's.
Yeah, why don't we go through the other presentation, Councilman, and then we can ask some questions. We have Ken McKenzie is here. He's the Executive Director of Urban Drainage and Flood Control District. And Steve Matakowski is the Senior Construction Manager for Urban Drainage and Flood Control District. And Steve was part of this Platte River project cleanup. And Ken, do you want to get started? Do you want to
Yes.
get started?
Thank you, Mayor Brinkman. Not only am I the Executive Director of the Urban Drainage and Flood Control District, but I'm also a 26-year resident of the city of Littleton. We moved here, my daughter was 5 and my son was 3, so that we could have good schools for them to go to. My wife did not want to leave Washington Park and passed out some brochures. I convinced her after she saw Stern Park, and it was the best decision we ever made, and I appreciate all the work the City Council's done to keep this a great city. I'm very, very proud to be a citizen of Littleton. I've lived in Idaho Springs, Boulder, Longmont, Denver, Fort Collins, Niwot. There's no place in Colorado like Littleton. I've been here for 26 years, and I intend to stay here.
If you tell me you love English teachers, I'm done.
You already saw my slides.
It's flood season. Flood season for us starts April 1st, So we are in flood season right now, and I want you to know that your citizens, those of your citizens that live near a floodway or near a floodplain, received these brochures in the mail yesterday or maybe today. And these brochures tell them that
It's a different brochure than he gave us.
you have what you have is a little promotional brochures. I didn't have enough of these to pass around. In fact, the one I'm holding up is actually for Adams County. I'm sorry about that. I grabbed the A and I thought, yeah. But the city of Littleton has a lot of flood hazards that the citizenry needs to be aware of. You have Rangeview Gulch and Lee Gulch and Littles Creek and Slaughterhouse Gulch right behind the office here in Big Dry Creek, and those all can be a flood threat. And it's important, not to scare people, but to let them know that it is a threat, and they should be aware of what to do when there's a flood and that sort of thing. So we're pleased to offer that service to you. I want to give a shameless plug for a public information campaign that we're embarking on. The Flood Control District has historically not been very good about communicating flood risk and also letting people know the value that the Flood Control District brings through the projects we do. Have you seen what's going on Mineral Avenue, just north of Mineral Avenue, Jackass Gulch? Major rework of Jackass Gulch, and it's looking fantastic, I think, right now. I'll be glad to see when that's finished. So I would like, are any of you on social media?
Yes.
All the time, I hope. I'm not. I actually am on Facebook. When my kids went to college, I got on Facebook, like a good parent. I am now tweeting occasionally, and I'm still trying to figure out this Instagram thing.
Here, why don't you hold that for 1 second longer? I'll take a photo and I'll put it up there. There you go.
I think the Instagram is about pictures. Maybe you know more about it than I do, but I want you to know that we really appreciate the long relationship that we've had with the city of Littleton. The Flood Control District really does appreciate your staff.
So just a comment, because people are watching, somebody's watching this, and they watch the reruns.
Right.
We are not likely to have a flood in the spring melt, are we? I mean,
Littleton will not have a flood from snowmelt. Snowmelt is not a flooding threat for, in fact, there are a couple of creeks. Bear Creek, the city of Morrison is at risk for runoff, snowmelt runoff. The city of Boulder is at risk from snowmelt runoff on Boulder Creek and South Boulder Creek. Clear Creek can present a flood risk, mostly to Georgetown and Idaho Springs, and by the time it gets down, it's such a long, narrow watershed that by the time it gets down to Golden, it's generally not a big problem.
Yeah, sometimes the water's been a bit high, but
yes.
The only reason I'm wanting us to make a point of this is people may think, oh, there's not an issue. They're looking now and they don't realize that when we get those floods, they come from stuff upriver, way upriver.
They can.
They can and we didn't even know anything was on its way.
And that's exactly what happened with the 1965 flood on Plum Creek and the South Platte River. Was it started at Monument, Palmer Lake, and it followed Plum Creek. And unfortunately, Plum Creek goes from south to north, and so did this massive storm. So as it followed the creek, the storm surge followed the flood wave, and it made it worse and worse. And by the time it got here, it was really bad. But luckily, there was a lot of warning for people, and so very few deaths with the 1965 flood risk. The greatest flood risk for the citizens of Littleton is flash flooding in the monsoon season in June and July, but it can start earlier than that. So we're in it now, and we're ready to. And we have a website that has alerts when they're flooded. People can sign up on Twitter, or they can sign up and they can get those flood alerts. And that's just what I came here to tell you. And I'm going to introduce Steve Materkowski. Steve is my senior construction manager. He's also a trained peace officer, and he serves on the Idaho Springs Police Department in his spare time. He's working for us, but he is our man on the South Platte River all day, every day. Steve.
Well, thanks, Ken. Appreciate being here. I have been on the South Platte River the majority of my 19 years with the Flood Control District, and that gives me the opportunity to see the river basically on a daily basis. And it's also given me an opportunity to see this problem up close and personal and how the problem has gotten worse. So what I'd like to do this evening is just kind of give you an overview, kind of a 30,000-foot view of the problem, its impacts to the river, why urban camping is such a problem, and maybe throw out some solutions. And for the sake of time, I'm going to go fairly quickly through these slides and not belabor too many other things. I do want to mention what a great partnership that was, though, that we were able to get a lot done with partnerships, and that's one of the things that I think is going to be a key to solving this problem eventually at a policy level. I deal with it on an operations level, but we'll jump right into this. So that's just something to just get you thinking about it. This is just over the border into Commerce City. So we helped do some remediation after Commerce City came in and spent about $40,000 in cleanup with a specialty crew that can handle the biohazards, that sort of thing. And you'll see more of these photos in a little bit. So, potential impacts, and these are just some that I've kind of brought out. Public perception, public safety, and environmental degradation. So we'll jump right into these. So something to think about, we're putting all these great projects in the ground where we're inviting people to come down to the river. We want to create that connectivity to get people to look at the South Platte River especially, but our other drainages, our other creeks as well, as an amenity. We want them to come down and recreate and have a good time, but do they feel safe to do so? Well, that's one of the negative impacts of this urban camping. I would say that they don't feel safe to do so. And as far as its impacts to local businesses, we saw a lot of those talking with local business owners when we did the cleanup and helped with that in Inglewood. There's some definite impacts to local businesses and to their customers. So again, a negative for urban camping. And what do we want the general public to think about these waterways? Well, we're building lots of neat projects. We look at River Run, for instance, and we built a surfway down there and all sorts of great things. We built some great infrastructure down there. But because of this problem, we've had to put special locks on the restroom doors, things like that. So if we're gonna create these great places, people need to feel safe. Public safety. Now, the potential for crimes, there's a lot of things that go along with the safety issues, but a big thing that people don't realize is how much of the crime and what's happening in there is actually homeless on homeless. One of the things that we find is different types of safety mechanisms that are put in there. Sharpened sticks, tripwires, things like that. Not so much to be used against, say, my maintenance guys that are going down there to do work, but to keep themselves safe from other people that may want to come in and steal from them, typically other campers that are down there. When we have this type of activity, especially larger clusters, the ones and twos that we historically saw up until about 4 years ago, not so much of an issue. But when we get 5, 6, 10, 12, 20 camps together, it becomes a magnet and starts to grow. And that's where things like overgrown vegetation and infrastructure, large culverts can be used for camping. Several years ago, City and County of Denver went into some large storm sewers, found 30, 40 people camping back in them. They had facilities back there of various types. They had a bicycle repair shop. I use that euphemistically. Hundreds of bicycles back there. You gotcha. Thank you for playing. So infrastructure can also be an issue that attracts them, and that's, again, a negative. Impacts on local law enforcement, fire, and EMS. Of course, first responders, there's not enough first responders in a lot of cases to go around. Calls for service are on the increase. Budgets are tight, and these areas tend to draw, as Sergeant McGrath mentioned, tends to draw those calls for service. So again, a negative impact. And here's the big one, the big area that the flood control district deals with, and that's from the environmental side. These first three, impacts to vegetation, soil erosion, impacts to water quality, all fit hand in glove. So the impacts to vegetation, whether it's cut down for fires, for structures, for whatever, cutting paths through areas of willows, to create different spaces, those sort of things. That vegetation degradation leads to the social trails, that sort of thing, leads to the impacts to the soil and the erosion. That erosion then, when we get different types of rain events or snow events, that ends up right in the river, as does a lot of the things in these camps, whether it's fecal matter, whether it's other types of biohazards, ends up in the river, and Sergeant McGrath spoke to that as far as water quality issues, and that does have an impact on things like Metro Wastewater, Englewood, Littleton Wastewater Treatment Facility. There are definite impacts to that, and I had heard that there was a study, I haven't gotten to look at it yet, but they said that a lot of the water quality issues from things like fecal coliforms, that sort of thing, were not coming from wildlife. Let's just put it that way. So there is a definite impact there.
So,
Yes, ma'am.
So this, all that stuff you're talking about, that goes into the river upstream from where the plant's tested after we put stuff in from the sewer plant, right?
The effluent.
And so that is also contributing to our risk of exceeding the limit.
Yes.
Because when it's measured, they don't know where it's coming from, but we're responsible for it.
That's correct, and that is one of the issues. And this activity is up and down the river. So, hazardous materials. You're going to see some pictures in here. You're going to see a lot of propane tanks. You're going to see all sorts of different types of materials. Basically, if we've got a 5-gallon bucket full of liquid, we've got another container full of liquid, we have to assume that it's potentially hazardous, because nobody's going to go in there and sniff it, whatever. It's got to be treated that way. Propane tanks that potentially don't have propane in them, that have liquid ammonia in them, precursor for methamphetamine manufacture, that sort of thing. We see just hundreds of propane tanks in these areas. Biohazards, we've already seen pictures of some of the needles that were out there. And the general health hazard, the LA and the San Diego hepatitis outbreak. I sit on the Emergency Management Committee for the American Public Works Association, and one of our members is an emergency manager from LA County. And this has gotten so bad, especially with the health issues, that it has entered the realm of emergency managers now. And I think I can speak for everybody in this room. I don't think we want to see the metro area become LA, because it is absolutely out of control out there if you follow that at all. So, some pictures. This is from that same general area in Commerce City. Like I mentioned, Commerce City spent about $40,000. The flood control district spent about another $25,000 in vegetation management and remediation. Pictures kind of speak for themselves, but here's a little, I'd mentioned propane tanks. This was for about, I did mention propane tanks, didn't I? Yeah, there's more of those. This is about a quarter-of-a-mile stretch that we spent that kind of money on there between the two agencies. The Flood Control District, Commerce City, over $60,000. That's what it looks like after we've taken out. Obviously, the company came in, took out all the trash and debris, all the biohazards. We came in and did the remediation, took out a lot of the screening vegetation so that Commerce City PD can now patrol this area more effectively. We can get in there. We have less hazard as far as dead and down trees getting into the river to create a flood impact if it were to get caught up on a bridge abutment or a pier or something like that, to increase flooding risk. So that's one of the things that we do, and one of the reasons why we do this sort of remediation effort. Another area after remediation. This is Commerce City as well, but further upstream into Adams County, around the I-270 flyover. It's just a little bit behind where this picture was taken. This is looking north. This is another area that we've got to come in and remediate. A lot of, when they did the enforcement action, when Commerce City did that enforcement action, moved people out, a lot of them moved it up into this area, and you can see the result. This is less than a year after we did the other remediation. This is an interesting picture. This is where a lot of them now move. This is another camp. There's about 8 to 10 people camping in there. It may be bigger. I haven't been there this week. But you notice in the center of the photo, I don't know if you can see what that rectangular object is right there. Does anybody know what that is? Solar panel. It's a solar panel. There's about 7 or 8 large solar panels out there, and I didn't even count how many smaller ones. All of them feeding into tents and charging different types of devices. So, I know, I can make this stuff up.
Where is this one?
This is on the west bank of the South Platte, just downstream of the I-270 flyover.
Okay.
So what can we do? In a couple slides, you're going to see some ideas for some of the things that we're talking about through the reach where we did the remediation with Inglewood, as far as potentially putting new trail through that area, and some ideas as far as what can be done to discourage this sort of activity. We want to, like I mentioned before, we want to create that connectivity and get people down to recreate, have fun, be down by the water, but yet we don't want to create an enticing area for them to camp. So you'll see a little bit of that. But that's what the creative trail design, what I'm referring to, how we shape those channel banks, how we shape the connective trails to get people down to the river. Vegetation management. We do that, like I mentioned, because it's part of flood control. We want to get that debris out. But also that vegetation management also increases that sight distance. It allows for not only my crews to get down there, but local law enforcement to be able to get down to the area, and it also helps with officer safety. A lot of times it's one officer out there patrolling, maybe a call for service down in the area. I know I don't like going down in the middle of the night with just a flashlight and a bunch of vegetation where I don't know what's going on down in there. So this helps from an officer safety standpoint. Increased law enforcement and ranger presence. Again, that's a matter of resources, but doing things or trying to enhance the ability for local law enforcement to get down in there and not let the problem grow past that 1 or 2 people that's there, to get to these big camps that create, they all create some sort of an issue, but the larger camps create the larger issues, and that's what we really want to make sure that we're getting ahead of. Policy and ordinance changes. Like I mentioned, I deal with this from an operations standpoint. From an operations standpoint, whether it's law enforcement or whether it's maintenance or whether it's construction, engineering, this is not a problem that's going to be solved by that. These are problems that are going to be solved at you guys' level, at a policy level. And there are things that can be done. City of Boulder is doing some of those things with their local ordinances. Denver's trying to do that. So at a policy level, there are things that can be done to help local law enforcement to get ahead of the problem and stay ahead of the problem. I think you mentioned, Reed, that we're not going to arrest our way out of this problem. That's not going to, that's not what we're talking about. But there are things to give some teeth to local law enforcement that will help mitigate the problem. Local partnerships. We saw an example of that with Sergeant McGrath's presentation. That was a great example of, we didn't have all the resources. Inglewood didn't have all the resources, but when we pooled those resources and we partnered together, something that the Flood Control District loves to do is partnering with our local agencies, great things can get done. Local partnerships to increase access to service, again, that's more of a policy thing. With the example down in Inglewood, great job was done reaching out to those local service providers to let them know what was going on, but also so that they could go in and make contact with that community and try to at least let them know what services were available to them. And finally, address the root cause issues via local policy. Again, don't want to beat that to death, but again, this is going to be solved at that policy level. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. All right, so here's an example of what I was talking about as far as creative engineering, creative trail design. So you can see some different, on the right-hand side of that, it's easy to see from here. Probably on your devices it's easier, but just ways that we can slope the banks so that they're stable, they're good places that we can get appropriate vegetation in there, but yet we don't create a magnet for illegal or unwanted activity. That's another example, shows some more of that. And this also shows what we're talking about as far as potentially punching trail through on the east side of the bank. That's something that the South Platte Working Group is probably going to be looking at in the future. So, sort of that. Any questions I could answer? Or
We'll wait on questions till the end.
Yeah.
Yeah, do we want to wait on that?
Yeah, we'll go with our next.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much. Our next presenter is Andy Jennings. He's the Director of Parks and Open Space with South Suburban Parks and Rec District.
Good evening. Also with me tonight is Dan Sharman, our senior park ranger, in case you have any questions that you might be able to answer. One of the things I wanted to do is just kind of talk about the roles and responsibilities of our rangers, because they're really not a law enforcement agency. We look at them more as our ambassadors, customer service to the public. We're Parks and Recreation, so our goal is our parks rules and regulations. You know, the hours of the park, who's got a permit or reservation for a particular piece of property. But those are the things that we really want our rangers to be focusing on and dealing with. But this type of, this homeless activity and all finds its way in, and we have to deal with it. And luckily, we're able to work cooperatively with the Littleton Police Department, with Inglewood, with the Arapahoe County, Douglas County. So when there are issues that we need more, enforcement capabilities, then we call in the appropriate organizations to help us with that. With that said, we do welfare checks. When we either get phone calls that, hey, there's somebody camping in this area, or the rangers are out on patrol and they come across a camp for someone, then they'll stop in to check on them, make sure they're aware of, okay, here's the park hours. It looks like you're setting up camp. You're going to need to move along at, depending on which area they're in or what city they're in. Within the city of Littleton, I believe it's either 10 or 11. But anyway, we give them the time frame that they're supposed to be out, and then we work with the police department as needed. If there's cases where we need to issue a notice to vacate, then it's the 48-hour notice, I believe, and then we come back and remove any belongings that are left and hold those for a couple of weeks, and then if they don't come claim them, then we discard those. So in 2015, we had 235 contacts, jumped to 297 in 16 and 366 in 2017. And about 35–40% of these are repeats. We're growing, if you take the repeats into consideration here, about 20 to 25 new contacts a year. So it's progressively getting worse each year. This map shows where we've had homeless camps and or contacts within the city, not just along the river, but throughout the city. I believe there were 32 locations, with half of those being in the river corridor.
What does high, medium, and occasional mean? What is high?
Well, high is that there's somebody there on a frequent basis. Low may be, or occasional may be, we've come through this location and we've found somebody maybe, once a year, twice a year. Medium may be 3 or 4 or 5 times, and then high is on a pretty frequent basis. Dan?
But you can go back there and there's somebody.
You'll expect to see someone repeating.
And then like with the other 2 presentations you just saw, these are some of the camps that we've dealt with. The one in the lower right, down in here, this actually was just a depression that from all different angles, you couldn't really see it. I think there was 2 brothers that were there for a couple of months. And then when we finally came across them, it was like, oh my gosh. And so 2 people had accumulated quite a bit of belongings.
Where is that?
It was off of Broadway and 470. So there's that vacant field we have on the east side of those buildings, and just driving by you couldn't see it. But if you got out of the truck and walked over there, there was a depression in the ground, and they were hiding down in that depression.
So how do you know there was a before you?
They told us when we went in there.
Oh, I tell you that too, just to pull your leg, so.
We posted it and told them no, and then we actually gave them more confidence on the stuff.
So then here's some of the stuff that had to clean up, and just like they've shown before, you've got areas, you know, they used for their restroom here on the ground or in a bucket. Lots of just debris and trash that's left. So it's kind of the same thing that the urban drainage and Inglewood have dealt with on a regular basis. Most of the issues, the camping type issues, the larger camps, are along the river corridor. The stuff that's in the parks, like over at Stern Park, they hang out under the pavilion, or might go over and set a tent up along the edge by some trees in kind of a native area. But for the most part, if they're in the parks, they're just there during the day. They're laying on the table, they're laying under a pavilion. They may have brought a basket or something in, but they haven't necessarily set up camp. We have had issues under Broadway along the Highland Canal, some of Denver Water's property, set up some camps as well. Anyway, we'd be happy to answer questions. I don't know if you guys want to come back up and we'll.
And we have our police chief, Doug Stevens. Chief, do you have anything you want to add? Like 5 minutes, chief?
Starting now. I'll keep it easy. I'm here to really kind of answer specific questions or talk to you about, you know, what we're seeing here and how we work to handle it.
We're trained. Council questions? Jerry.
So, Chief Stevens and for Sarge, is the problem spread, or homelessness is spreading to other parks? Like, and I know you have many parks in Inglewood, but in Kittredge Park, things like that, I know we have issues. Is it spreading, becoming a larger problem?
The problem's definitely getting worse and spreading. In terms of our parks, we have pretty close control. We had some problems at one little park. It's actually a south suburban park called Oxbow, and you have to drive through the city of Littleton to get to it. I didn't even know it existed. So that kind of gives you an idea of where we're at on the radar screen with that. Our parks, generally, we get there pretty quick. Bellevue Park, some of the stuff down in there, we have a little more issue with some of that. We have, you know, a split line between Littleton and us, and we have to pull up the maps and decide who's is what. There's some nice secluded in there, areas in there too. We have seen a monumental growth in homeless population over the last 4 to 5 years in the city of Inglewood.
I'd agree. In Littleton, I think that the parks, you know, the higher visibility areas, were much better at identifying locations as they're popping up and dealing with them quickly. It's the places like you were just showing in your slides that are out of sight, kind of in that unknown area of ownership, that we tend to see larger problems spring up.
And when you chase them away, though, where do they, I mean,
that's just it, and Sergeant McGrath touched on that. You know, in your project, which is a tremendous example of collaborative work to try to address the longer-term issues, you have the healthcare providers, you have the shelter folks that are partnering to try to have a longer-term solution. We're good at the police department, and the rangers and stuff are fairly good at displacing, right? But we don't solve that issue. We're not going to solve that problem. We can't really put them in jail. There's capacity issues. It's not the right answer anyway. You know, so when we move along, and like Sergeant McGrath said, we have the services, they have the services available. We partner with All Health Network on some of our chronic homeless here in Littleton, and with minimal success, because many of them don't want help and will not voluntarily cooperate. So they'll move on, and like you were saying, you know, 3 days later we'll have either them back or another group back in some of the same spots.
Carol.
I've gotten 2 phone calls from citizens in the last week about homeless people along in the canal. How long does it take to have that problem addressed, and for the citizens to feel that the problem has been addressed?
You know, in Littleton, when we receive a complaint in the police department, or codes receives a complaint, at least for the police department, we'll address it immediately. We'll send an officer out as soon as the one becomes available to take a look. If it's just some folks that have not established a camp per se, haven't erected structures, which is is kind of a broad term, right? A tarp over something, could be a structure. But anyway, we'll go out and we'll contact those folks. We'll address, hey, there's been some complaints. Most of the time, if the folks have not established themselves haven't built up too much stuff, they don't consider that home. It's easy for them to move along. They'll usually cooperate with us and move along. Whether that's another 200 yards down the canal or whatever, and then we address it with another neighbor later, is something else. If they are more established and we have had that as everybody else, we'll post. We'll work with codes. We'll post. If it's Littleton property, we'll post and give them notice, and then we will go into Public Works later and clear out the larger camps.
What do you mean by post?
We provide, like Sergeant Grass showed, we put up flyers, hand out, you have X number of hours, this is an illegal camp site, you have X number of hours or days to vacate the premises. At this point, people are moving property. It's remaining, if you stay, you're subject to arrest potentially.
About how long is that process? I'm not pushing, I'm
I
just
think it's
curious.
72 hours on codes. We'll post for a minimum of 72 hours, I believe. That's a code enforcement thing. Does that sound right, Steve?
I think it's 40, yes. And
Depends on, it kind of depends too on whether it's City of Littleton property or maybe in the South Suburban property.
Sheridan's 72, they just went 72. We joined with Littleton.
Dan, come on up to the table.
And in the canal, it's Denver Water property?
It varies, I think.
Yes.
So, along the High Line.
That's correct, Councilman. Particularly in the Highline Canal, there's actually a mixture of ownership. You have Denver Water, you have pieces out of South Suburban, you have private property. I was out there on Friday touring a homeless encampment.
It's probably one of mine.
Probably was. And we were that same day already working with Denver Water and getting their staff involved, as well as pointed out. And we're also working with private property owners along there because a lot of the trespassing actually occurs on private property. And one of the things that we need is for private property owners to work with the city in posting those areas, no trespassing. And we are already working on that. So literally, we had a citizen call. I had a citizen call on Wednesday. The first day I could do the tour was Friday. And by Friday afternoon, we were already taking steps to begin to address this so that we can make sure the goal is we obviously are going to have to clean it up, working with Denver Water, and remove the canopy. That's already in the process. Denver Water has been very good. They're very aware of it, and they're taking steps as well to do what they need to do.
And then is there patrolling of that area after it's vacated, or does it need to be reported again if something shows up?
We patrol all those areas quite often, and we know where all their hiding places are.
That's what I meant, yeah. Complaints were about the canal.
So the Rangers don't do the Highline Canal?
We do the Highline Canal. In fact, are you talking off of the Euclid there behind the Options High School?
No, I was talking about just south of Cayley, behind the Wife Saver laundromat on Broadway.
Yeah, so again, it varies. The jurisdictions vary. Everything in the city of Littleton, the officers will try to get to as we can. And obviously that depends on call load. I can't tell you that we are proactively, regularly patrolling any of those areas, to be honest with you.
Not saying you should, just wanted to know what
We do know,
citizens can expect.
there are, like anybody else here, we do know of some of the more prolific areas, and our officers do the best they can to stay on top of that. I think short-term solutions or short-term help is that the Rangers, they're probably the first line of defense on their areas because they're there more often than anybody else, and they can make those contacts and be those ambassadors and talk with folks and have a relationship to say, you can't establish, you can't camp here, you can't stay here, and they'll keep it moving. Same thing in Inglewood and in Denver and Littleton, all along the river. As folks are contact folks before they establish those longer term camps, that's the key. What happens with them if we're just moving them along, that's the reality of it, and I don't know how to address that.
Okay, thanks. Thanks all of you. Karina?
For those that have not, established a structure, someone that's sitting at the park all day long, can you do anything about that? Or is it you have to wait until the park closes at 10 o'clock?
Thank you for bringing that up. It's very common, and as the weather gets warmer, we're going to get more and more calls. Law enforcement, at least in Littleton, I assume Inglewood has the exact same issue. In the public parks, absent a reservation of a structure or something like that, everyone has equal right to use that. As long as they're not established or violating a park ordinance, a city ordinance about establishing a structure, amplified sound, different things that are in there. But if there's just someone homeless sitting at the table at the park all day long, they have an equal right to do that as anybody else. We'll get calls on that a lot, and we do get several complaints on that, written complaints, that folks don't feel safe using the park because there's someone that is homeless there that hangs out there and things like that. We will go in after park curfew, after the parks close, and we'll make sure that people are not there, but that's really what we're limited in our ability to enforce.
We do welfare checks, and when we get those complaints, we remind people that, well, it's not illegal to be homeless, but we'll remind those people that make sure you're not out of the park by 11 o'clock or hours. So.
This is kind of a question to everyone, and you may have different answers based on kind of what you do and your perspectives. What is causing this increase right now? We hear things like, oh, it's coming from Denver, and they're busing them, and those kinds of stories. But give me facts, give me experience, give me your knowledge of what is causing this rise so quickly.
I've had, we've been contacting homeless for the last 25 years, but over the last 5 years it's really increased. But a lot of people say, originally they said, well, I'm here for the pot. And so we've seen an increase since we did pass that. But the price of homes have gone up, rent. We do find people that are working, they can't afford rent. Then a lot of people are, a lot of alcohol, drugs, some runaways, some young kids in their early 20s and their homes. So there's all sorts of reasons.
In Denver, you see a lot of what, over the last 19 years that I've dealt with, what I would refer to as traditional homeless. That's kind of a oxymoron almost, but the typically older, if you want to think somebody maybe a Vietnam vet that might be self-medicating, there might be some mental health issues, people that we never had problems with before, for the most part. There's that group, and that group is still there to some extent, but there is a larger, younger, transient group that is here for, if they, came for the pot, stayed for the affordable housing. That's where they're camping, and that's what they're doing, and that's the group that I contact more when I'm down doing maintenance on the river, that sort of thing, and that also, in my perspective, seems to be the more aggressive group as well, potentially, is that younger set.
That's what I want to follow up with a question on that too, is that what is the hazards, physical hazard to other people who aren't homeless, just riding their bike, walking by, that you're all dealing with here? Is there a hazard, or is it really pretty much in their own community?
I don't think we see very many crimes committed by the homeless on other people.
Outside the community?
Outside of the community. We just don't see that. We don't demographically capture homeless. It's not something that we do. And I don't think it's something that we want to do until it becomes a federal mandate that we do that. So it's just anecdotal information, but we're really not seeing a lot of that. And just to jump back to your question, let me address the Denver push, because that's always kind of an elephant in a room like this. And the first push that Denver has done is they have built pretty much every imaginable space in the city. So that has eliminated a lot of places where people used to be able to habitate, and they no longer can. And I think probably Chief Doug here could speak more to that, his years in Denver. And secondarily, what we're seeing with our people, and my guess is it's completely true with the people here, because we have a lot of crossover, and we work with service providers that are also in your city, is that a lot of our homeless people, they are these younger people. Some of them are violent, but for the most part, they're not. And the shelters in Denver are scary, and there's a lot of violence, and our homeless people are largely wanting to be away from that element.
I would agree with a lot of that too. I think what you would see mostly with crime involving homeless folks, especially the younger set, I think they're traditional homeless, like you were talking about, pretty much stay to themselves and don't really bother people. But there's that element that chooses to be where they're at, and I think you see more crimes of opportunity, more property crimes, mainly to steal things that you talked about, the bicycle repair shop, right? To steal things that they could later sell, to make money, and whether that's open garages or open cars or things like that. And we see that, in Littleton, we see those crimes of opportunity occur, and while certainly not all of that is due to homeless, I think some of that may be. Yeah, but as far as violent crime, again, we don't see, it's like gang crime for the most part is not necessarily random usually. Neither is this type of crime. It's usually against each other. Again, usually involving theft or drugs or something like that. We do have, I will speculate and be very confident in this speculation. There's a lot of crime amongst themselves that is unreported to us, including violent crime, robberies and assaults and sexual assaults, things like that. I think are probably much more common than anybody would even know, and they don't get reported to us, and that's a concern as well.
Notice an increase in years past, clean debris. Now the needles are an epidemic.
The needles?
And the latest one we've seen is they're cooking mothballs, getting high off of mothballs. Very high.
Peggy, did you have a question?
No, I was going to comment that I take the light rail usually when I go down to London. And sometimes there are people, when we come back, coming out on the train. And I think because we have that, and certain times of the day, nobody's checking tickets. And people know that, so they can come out and spill into the closer neighborhoods and along the trails and whatever very easily, and in several cities coming from Denver, so.
Go ahead.
Kind of follow up on Jerry's question before about, with people. I think, that's the one thing everyone kind of loses sight of. These are people, and that the camping isn't necessarily the problem, it's a symptom of the problem. And homelessness has caused a variety of issues. I don't think we, as a council, are going to be able to solve all those problems, or all the sources of those problems. And I think it's important to take a look at that and try to do the best we can to involve the mental health professionals, all health and all that, to try to at least get to some of the underwriting issues. But I think we can address the symptom of having this urban camping here, along with, I think it was the slide you put up with the various different paths and things like that, to make these areas not enticing to attract this activity. And I think that's something we need to take a look at there, but see if we can figure out a way to work together with all of our partners and try to address as much of the underlying problems as we can. But no one has the solution as far as I'm concerned, because it's been a problem. It's a problem everywhere, and it's been a problem throughout history. I mean, going back centuries and millennia. So it's something that we have to deal with a little bit more in our face now than we had in the past. So.
I have a question for Inglewood. So Denver had a big, when Denver went in and at one point they cleared out an entire shanty town that had been built up, and they threw away all of the items. And so then there was a huge uproar about that. It wasn't that they tore it down, it was that they discarded their items. So what you guys are doing is you put up the sign that says, you need to vacate this and take, you're hoping they'll take as much as they can out of there. So what they leave, then does that make it legal for you to then discard what they've left? I'm looking at policy.
Well, whether it's legal or not is a difficult question, but the best answer to that is what they leave, we sort out what's trash and what's potentially valuable. And one particular person that we dealt with, he was actually somebody that we displaced from his home because he'd been using a lot of methamphetamine in it, and we got the house condemned. It was a real problem house. He moved down to the river. We dealt with him. He moved on. We took a lot of his property after 2 weeks of trying to work with him to get him to move it. And about 2 months later, he came in and I helped him. I got a Parks Department pickup and loaded the back of it up with his property and took it to his campsite in Denver and helped him unload it there.
Going the right direction, though. I appreciate that.
There you go.
Yeah.
That may be the solution.
He chose to go into Denver, and throughout this whole process, when we did this, everyone was on board, and I'm sure Andy can attest to multitudes of emails that he's gotten from me with timelines and plans and everything. But the important thing is that we kept his property because that's a hot button topic, that it is their property, and if they truly abandon it, it's a difficult question. It's a hard question for us to make. That's more probably of a legal question.
It is.
Yeah.
That's something that we certainly work with the police department on an ongoing basis because it's a very complicated legal question.
I know Denver has rented warehouses and facilities, and then they have a big camp. They'll gather whatever, again, anything invaluable is subjective, right? So they'll take anything that they feel is not obviously trash and they'll warehouse it. That also becomes a biohazard issue, you know? I mean, some of this stuff is not the cleanest stuff in the world, and they'll warehouse it for a certain amount of time, all at expense, you know, to do that. And then after that time, then they will discard it as abandoned property if it's not claimed within a certain amount of time. And that time is variable, I think, depending on what court decides what at what time, and Steve can attest to that, I think. So there's a lot of logistical issues and expense, long-term expense.
They've actually just expanded their facility because they have so much. A lot of the stuff that if they can consider it a biohazard, they are using that company to actually just get rid of it. Because some of these are very expensive tents and sleeping bags, but they are not something you'd want to touch without gloves on. And I want to say, I think they're keeping it for 90 days, so it's quite a big issue. They've rented more and more and more space.
And I can tell you just from a property management standpoint, from our own property bureau, with not this type of stuff, what's not questionable stuff, getting stuff into it, it's pretty easy, but maintaining that out the other end at a certain timeline is incredibly difficult and incredibly staff intensive and time intensive.
How often do people claim these things? Just to follow up on that, how often? What percentage of people actually come back?
Very small,
Very small, okay.
very small percentage.
And we had an issue where we were storing some down at Carson Nature Center over by the maintenance shop. And he's like, nobody would ever come. And after, we said we'd keep it for 2 weeks, but, maybe a month later, we discarded it. And, well, somebody found out that, there's some stuff there. So then it was like, here's the local thrift store. Let's all go over there and rummage through it and claim it as ours. And so, now we didn't know, does this belong to you or not belong to you? And then they were trying to take stuff that belonged to South Platte Park. This is my fire ring too. So no, that's not. So now there's the concern of, if we are going to do this, how is it going to be cataloged? How do we know who's supposed to get it? So it's a concern.
It's a lot of resources to.
That's why you saw the
trash
maps that you saw, the GPS coordinates, so that if somebody comes back and says, I had a camp here, they have to be able to describe the items and tell us where the camp was and give us that kind of information. Hopefully we have a name attached to it, but yeah, it overtaxed our evidence system. We have an extra building and it's full, and I actually stored some of the property in our outside vehicle storage, because it was a lot of outdoor stuff too. So it's a major problem that gets expensive quickly.
One more quick question, and then Carol. So, in addition to the river, our cities share the railroad, and so I know that we've seen a lot of encampments crop up along the river, or along the railroad. Share any experience with that, because those are almost easier to hide because of the way that in many cases, the river, or the railroad, starts with an R, the way they built it, they've got those hiding places. And we know over time that, particularly in Littleton, we've seen a couple of them now that get along the mineral area with the light rail. And so between all of that, so talk a little bit about, and I'm asking because I'm more in search of trying to discover, is there some sort of way that we can manage this? Why is it happening? How does it happen? One of the things that triggered for me was when you said that they're almost voluntarily homeless. Because it isn't that they don't want a house, it isn't that they don't want to have electricity, and they don't want to have, all those things. It's that they don't want to be part of that homeless world. So they don't want to go to the shelters and those types of things. And so pushing them around isn't doing any good. So, those are the kind of things that maybe help lead to a way to not so much eliminate it, but start to control it, start to manage it. And control is the wrong word, but manage it so that it isn't this problem here. So that's why I'm just curious also then about the railroads as it may apply to Littleton. Any experience?
I can address that a little bit. So again, it comes down to what Steve touched on in jurisdiction and property, who owns the property. We have good relationships with the railroads and RTD. Obviously has their own police department and security personnel. They're pretty good about maintaining their lines and their properties there, and working with folks. And whether it's UP or Burlington or whoever on the railroad property as well, they'll work with us, or they have their own police departments as well that help to try to maintain those areas. It comes down to where we started the whole thing, is about awareness on, there's a camp going up, how quickly can we, whoever's jurisdiction that is, get in there and talk with folks about, hey, you can't be here, and then trying to work with them voluntarily to move on. And then ultimately, if it comes down to where we do have to take some sort of enforcement action or clear out the park, who's going to be able to post that? Is it private property? Will they sign a complaint for trespass? And like Steve was saying, we post for trespass, give them time. And at what point does who take over the property? So see where it just very quickly spirals into a much larger thing. But to hopefully answer your question, we do have good relationships with RTD and the railroads to take enforcement action, to assist them with enforcement action, and vice versa. They call us when they need us. And I think it just pops up pretty quick and gets entrenched pretty quick.
Yeah.
So I think by the time you identify some of these places, and I'm sure the Rangers know this better than anybody. Yesterday there's nothing there. The day after tomorrow there's 3 camps up, quickly. So.
Carol.
Your name's Steve?
Yes.
Yeah, you laughed when somebody mentioned the van loads of homeless brought from Denver to Littleton. Is that a true occurrence, or is that myth?
That's myth. It's for, Denver.
That's myth?
That's the common, we like to joke about that. Same thing with the light rail, loading them up on light rail and they get off at McDonald's. It's the last stop. I just don't think that's true. I think that, I can't remember which person up here was talking about the development. Was that you? In Denver, having worked in Denver for a long time, and I actually lived in downtown Denver when I was really young, and Coors Field wasn't there yet. Everything basically from Blake Street toward the highway was, like, they called it the bottoms. It was just abandoned property, and there was tons and tons and tons of people go there now. It's a whole different story. They're developing all the way up to I-70 and beyond, all the way along the river.
There's no viaducts anymore.
Yeah, it's prime property now. So I think that displaced a ton.
That's a really good explanation.
And I just, I don't think that, I think that just over time as developed, people just move further and further south down the river because that's a good place to be, right? Like you're talking about a lot of vegetation, they like the river, and it's a natural pathway.
But it's more of a progression than Denver decided to haul their trash to Littleton.
Yeah, and I worked in a lot of different places in Denver, including downtown as a lieutenant down there for a few years, and they had the largest homeless issue in Denver's downtown, and never once was there any kind of push to move them anywhere. It was more of deal with this particular park, how do we deal with this particular area, and what resources are available.
Thanks.
If you drive into Denver 24/7, you will notice a tremendous homeless population just throughout the city. The more you get into downtown, parks in the middle of the night occupied 50, 100 people. So, yeah, I don't think that's probably a fair thing. Undoubtedly, it's happened once or twice where a Denver cop has dropped somebody off in Inglewood, and an Inglewood cop has dropped somebody off in Denver and said, "Get out of my city."
I never have.
But not bus loads. Never by the bus.
It's too obvious.
Or the train. But I think one comment that the mayor made was about the shelters and things like that. And I think part of the issue too is for a large percentage of folks, first off, there's not a lot of shelter space available, right? And in the traditional homeless, like a homeless family or something like those are folks that can't afford a house, and those are the folks that are welcoming to go into a shelter, and they want to do that. Shelters come with a lot of rules, right? There's curfews, there's rules about what you can do, who you can be with, those types of things, just to maintain order. And I think a lot of folks don't want to abide by those rules because of their lifestyle choices they're making. So even if we provide those services, or so those services are available, I think it's a low percentage of folks who would take advantage.
We hand out a lot of information for United Way and all that. 95% of the homeless are males, and they don't want that information.
I went to the Inglewood Forum a few weeks ago, and there's more of a faith-based community that's kind of come together. That's how can we help and work and identify these homeless issues? And a couple of things that they had talked about was particularly the faith-based group said, I meet with a lot of them, and he goes, and they're not coming out of Denver. He goes, they live in Inglewood, they grew up in Inglewood, they've lived in Inglewood. Unfortunately, they became homeless because they lost their job. Maybe a family member came down with cancer, and they spent all their money, on medical bills, and then they lost their home and their job because of that, and now they're homeless. And they said, they've stayed there because they're familiar with the area, and they know people, and they know the area, and so they stay in their familiar surroundings. And then they had a gentleman there that also, he was talking about why people were homeless, and they discussed, the whole, I lost my job, this happened, that happened, whatever, and he said, sometimes you get back on your feet, you get a job, you get whatever, and then you get responsibilities, and you got bills to pay, and then the anxiety kind of sets in, and then you're just like, oh my gosh, life was so much easier when I was on the blanket under the tree in the park, and next thing you know, they pick up a bottle, and then they start drinking again, and then they're right back to square one, and they never get out of the system. And he said that happens a lot. And it may be mental health and drugs, and they go in and they get help and they get cleaned up, and then the medications run out, and then their mental health kicks back in, and then they're back to square one. So it's kind of this vicious cycle. And I don't know how you wrap your arms around fixing that.
It's
Nobody
very,
does.
very hairy.
Nobody does.
I want to, on behalf of council, thank all of you for all that you've done and all that you do. And thank you for being here tonight and sharing your thoughts. I mean, this is certainly not the end of the conversation. And we appreciate what you've shared tonight and the work that you're doing to help with this. So thank you. And so there aren't any more questions. We'll move to our next topic.
Yeah,
So
we're not applauding or anything.
we'll just jump into the next one.
I'm gonna walk right down there and I'll be ready.
Thanks for having us.
See you. Thanks, Chief. I know, yes. He likes to talk. Thank you. Whether you want. I'll take it. Thanks, Sarge.
We're going to get right to the...
We gotta get out of the trail.
Okay, that's going to get right to the point without a call.
I know. Your leg's not working, they're asleep.
One of the things that, if you can address, I don't have to ask if you can address it, is like for the calls or if you want to talk to them. Just hit on
Presentation from the city attorney on quasi-judicial proceedings. So this is an opportunity for you to kind of share the rules and guidelines and us to ask questions and make sure that we understand everything and
Absolutely, Mayor.
make it properly.
What's before you tonight is we have prepared a draft of a set of rules for quasi-judicial proceedings. So what do we mean by quasi-judicial? Simply, this is where council or one of the city's bodies act as a judge. Now, in some states, that is an extremely rare thing. That's not the case in Colorado. In Colorado, for example, rezonings are a quasi-judicial function. All of the actions of the Board of Adjustment, generally on variances, are quasi-judicial. Building Board of Appeals, when they act on building official actions, are quasi-judicial. And the Historic Preservation Board, when they act on certificate of appropriateness, are acting in a quasi-judicial capacity. In all of these, you're acting as a judge. Now, that's different from a lot of the time when you're wearing a hat as a legislator. And a different set of rules apply. We talk an awful lot about all the legislative rules, but we really haven't talked much about the quasi-judicial rules. And this is not unusual. You'd find this in pretty much many cities across the state. In fact, if you look at our city code, we have one section in the whole city code that just provides you a general description of what a quasi-judicial proceeding is, but doesn't provide any rules. The idea behind the rules are, unlike a legislative proceeding, when you function as a judge, there are some very, very specific rules that you have to follow. The first one, you always hear me in council meetings when you're dealing with the rezoning say, now council, you can only consider the record. A legislator can bring in their own personal experience and their own background, but when you're acting as a judge, you are limited to the record. The testimony, the documents that are in front of you. If it's not part of the record, as a judge will tell you, it doesn't exist. The second thing with a quasi-judicial proceeding is that the parties are very specific. In a zoning case, for example, you will have an applicant and you will have the staff. Those are the parties. Now, you may have witnesses who participate in the public hearing and give testimony. They are not parties. They don't have standing in the proceeding. They're just providing information that's part of that record. And as a judge, because that's how you're functioning, you can certainly weigh the credibility of those witnesses, but you're just simply considering their testimony. Now, one of the biggest, most important parts of quasi-judicial proceedings is what we call ex parte communications, which is a really fancy legal term. We can make it really simple. It means that you're having sidebar communications with one party or the other outside the presence of the other. I function as an arbitrator or a substitute judge, and when I do that, I can only have conversations with both parties. I can't have a conversation with one party that outside the presence of the other. The same is true with counsel in quasi-judicial proceedings. You, as much as a citizen might like to say, oh, gee, councilman, but can I talk to you about the zoning case? No. That is an ex parte communication, and that can actually invalidate the entire zoning case. And you have an ethical obligation, and actually an obligation under the law, that if you've had ex parte communications, to disclose those, and those become part of the record.
Question?
Yes.
Can we ask questions as you go? Do you mind?
In terms of
No, do you mind if we ask questions as you go?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yes, you mind?
So he says he minds. He says
No, go ahead.
Yes.
Please. ask questions as I go.
It is speaking.
Absolutely, ma'am.
So you just gave the example that if a citizen comes up and says, can I talk to you about, we have to say, no, that's ex parte. So I have always understood that the production of evidence or those types of things would be what is part of that ex parte. If a citizen comes up, if we're going to deal with a rezone, and a citizen comes up and says, I understand you're going to hear this rezone, you know, what day is it, and or
yes,
in fact, those types of things. I mean, what I don't want to do is I don't want to, because this has happened. We've had occasions where the council has had a ex parte or a quasi-judicial matter, and the citizens feel very shut out, feel very shut down, feel very, you know, just no, and we're not going to get into a conversation. Well, this is what I think about it. I know that's not the right.
Yes.
But I think, could you guide us as to what would be the legal way that we could communicate back with a citizen who has approached us on a quasi-judicial, so that they don't feel like that we are no longer someone they can speak to about an issue that may be affecting their life?
Absolutely. informing a citizen, for example, that there's going to be a public hearing at the April 24th council meeting, perfectly okay. You're not talking about the merits. And the key is when we talk about the merits. What I mean by the merits, the actual substance of the case. You can certainly tell citizens, yes, there's going to be a public hearing on this day. Here's when the case is going to be presented. That's not an ex-parte communication. What I would recommend is if a citizen says, well, I want to tell you how bad this grocery store project is and how terrible it is. That's where you need to say, you're certainly welcome to come to the public hearing and give your testimony, but under the law, I'm only allowed to consider what's in the record. If I talk to you about the merits of this outside the council meeting, I can't consider it because it's not part of the record, and it's improper for me to do that. So, citizen, I encourage you to come to the council meeting. I encourage you to present your views, but I encourage you to do it at the council meeting where it's part of the record. Yes, Councilman?
Yes, so occasionally get an email, and I don't necessarily realize what I'm reading until I'm well into it. Or I get a phone message left on the phone, the same kind of thing. With the emails, what I have done in the past is thank the person for sending me the email, and I say I am forwarding it to the city clerk for inclusion in the public record, and it's shared with all the council people.
That's absolutely the correct way to do it. That's the exact correct way to do it. Now, sometimes when we get phone messages, and in today's world, text messages, because people love my phone for whatever reason. I had probably 10 text messages during this meeting, go figure. People like to communicate with their elected officials that way. Keep in mind, under Colorado law, your text messages are a public record. So if it's about the merits of this, what I would recommend that you do is you transcribe that text message and send it to the clerk for inclusion in the record. The same thing if you get a voicemail. A citizen calls you up. Oh, Councilmember so-and-so, I want to tell you how terrible this grocery store project is. It is just so awful, and on and on and on. I know it's a bit of an effort, but that way, that's all part of the record. And then that can be considered. What I recommend against is occasionally, and you would think, okay, with zoning lawyers and developers, everybody knows in Colorado zoning's quasi-judicial. You can't do this. Well, sometimes people do things anyways. And so if you get that, well, I'd love to talk to you about this zoning case. What we as staff are going to do, and you'll see in this rule, these proposed rules, and we've already been doing this some with the Planning Commission, is developing a notice that once the rule comes into place, once an application is filed. So until an application is filed, there's no proceeding. So you're not bound by quasi-judicial rules. One of the things that in these rules we propose to do would be that anytime we get a quasi-judicial application that's coming before you, we just send you a form saying, we need to let you know, Council, we now have an application in place. The quasi-judicial rules now apply, so that you know. Because realistically, we get applications in every day, and you would not know if we don't tell you. And so that becomes an important part. Now, why are quasi-judicial rules really important? Because in these proceedings, we have to provide applicants what we call procedural due process, which is a big, long legal term. What it means is the city follows its rules, and an applicant can depend on the city following its rules. So what happens if the city doesn't provide procedural due process in accordance with its rules? An applicant can sue the city for violation of their civil rights under the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution under the Colorado Constitution. And so it's very important we provide that procedural due process. Now, what these rules provide as well is they set forth how the proceedings are handled in terms of a quasi-judicial proceeding. Because none of you are judges. And the reality of it is, if you were judges and you were doing this every day, you would say, okay, I have the rules of court, I have the rules of evidence, and this is what I do every day. But when you function as legislators in one case, and then the next case you jump over and function as judges, it gets very confusing. So one of the purposes of the rules is to provide a basic set of rules that council can follow and the presiding officers of these boards can follow, and making sure that we consistently have quasi-judicial proceedings, that we provide the procedural due process which we're required to do. Now, one of the big issues that always comes up in quasi-judicial proceedings is there's a different evidentiary standard. And again, lawyers love to talk about this stuff all day, but we can make it very simple. When you act in a legislative capacity, you basically just have to have what we call a rational basis of what a reasonable person believes is appropriate, and you can legislate. That's not the rule for quasi-judicial. For quasi-judicial, you have to base the decision on the record, and you have to show that there is substantial, competent evidence. What does that mean? It means that there is sufficient evidence that the facts have either been proven or that you can, based on the evidence, infer a particular fact. It isn't enough to have a reasonable basis. You have to meet the substantial evidence standard. And it has to be consistent with the applicable law. Now, that's why in zonings, again, you will hear me say, now council, you have to base your decision on the record. If you're going to deny a zoning case, you have to base the denial on the record. You have to explain why there wasn't that kind of evidence. In a legislative decision, that's not the case. In a legislative decision, the council acts based on a rational basis.
A quick question about the substantial competent evidence. So someone just complaining, I don't like this because it's ugly, that's not substantial competent evidence.
That's correct. It has to be more than that. It has to be something that you can look at and say, based on this evidence, it either supports the conclusion or this evidence undercuts the conclusion. For example, if a person comes in and says, well, this proposed grocery store, the city's general plan says that grocery stores and neighborhood commercial should only be located at arterial intersections. This is located on the intersection of two collectors. It violates the city's general plan. That is competent evidence that would suggest that you should not consider rezoning there. On the other hand, if that person comes in and says, well, I think there's just too many grocery stores. We have Sprouts, Safeways, Whole Foods, Trader Joe's, and on and on. You don't need any more grocery stores, council. That's not substantial competent evidence. Yes?
So when the evidence that's being presented versus evidence available, for example, the comprehensive plan may have section 5.2 that is presented as a justification of why this, this rezoning could work. But there are other sections of the comprehensive plan that were not presented as part of the presentation. But the whole comprehensive plan is part of the evidence, regardless if it was only pieces of it were presented, correct?
Let's talk about that for a second. Now, normally, as a court, you can take what we call judicial notice of certain documents. So yes, you can take judicial notice of the city's comprehensive plan, even though it wasn't moved for admission. Now, one of the things we're going to work on here, if the council's agreeable, is in some of our quasi-judicial hearings in the past, not this council, but past councils, we haven't necessarily done a good job of making sure we actually move all the exhibits into the record. And we haven't done what we really need to be doing. And this is no one's fault. It's not the council's fault. It's not the lawyer's fault. It's just we haven't had rules for quasi-judicial proceedings. And one of the things that I am want to make sure we do in the future, so that we have that procedural due process is that we move stuff into the record. And council, you're always free to say, Mr. Kemp, we'd like to consider the entire comprehensive plan. Can we do that? And I would say, well, yes, that's an official government document of the city of Littleton. You are free to take judicial notice of the entire plan.
Do we do that at the meeting?
You can do that at the meeting. If you just ask me, I will say that, and then that becomes part of the record.
So when the city staff says, and it meets the comp plan standards, is that it?
Normally what you should be, and I think you see them more recently in the city report, in the staff reports, the staff will say it meets standard so-and-so of the comp plan, and it meets standard so-and-so of the comp plan. Now, they may not present all of that in the PowerPoint or whatever, because
it implies the whole comp
plan. But it's in the staff report, and that staff report is part of the record. And if council is agreeable, what I would like to do is bring these to you in a regular general business item by resolution for the council to adopt. It's the formal rules of procedure that would be binding not just on the council, but all of our boards that do quasi-judicial proceedings. Now, sometimes you have other types of proceedings that are not quasi-judicial, but they raise quasi-judicial issues. And the classic one is, in our charter, it requires public hearings on second read for ordinances. Now, in other jurisdictions across the United States, it doesn't do that. And in some state constitutions for legislation, they may have to have multiple readings, but they're not required to have formal public hearings. Why is that important? Because in a formal public hearing, what underlies that is a recognition that council members are going to consider all of that testimony in a public hearing before they reach a decision. Now it doesn't matter what decision you reach. You can be for, against, doesn't matter. But that you not make that decision until you've considered the testimony in a public hearing. So people will say, well, can I say that I think I support ordinance X? Sure, that you're not committing to it. What concerns me is when council members say, well, I've already decided I'm voting against that. And it's like, well, but there's a public hearing. You are, as part of your fiduciary duties as a council member, you're to consider that testimony in a public hearing before saying you've reached a final decision. And so it's very important, I would say, whenever you see an item that's a public hearing, as sometimes constituents will say, well, I want you to commit to vote no. You can certainly say, I understand your concerns. I'm concerned too. I'm certainly going to take that on to account, but I need to keep in mind that there's a public hearing and I have an obligation to consider all the testimony that's given in that public hearing before I make a final decision.
Are you talking about all public hearings or just the quasi-judicial ones?
I would suggest in all public hearings you have a fiduciary obligation as a council member not to say, well, I hate this, I'm voting against it. There's nothing that can be said in a public hearing that will cause me to consider anything else. Because essentially you've done undercut the whole purpose of the public hearing.
Or the reverse.
Or the reverse. Oh, I love this. It's the most greatest thing since sliced bread. It doesn't matter what's said in the public hearing, I'm going to vote for it. Same thing. Because what the whole public hearing is for the public to give you their testimony before you make that decision.
The difference with that's not a quasi-judicial setting because we're not only considering just the public comment.
Yes, you're hearing everything that's relevant to the matter. And you're not functioning where you're adopting a substantial competent evidence standard. You're adopting a rational basis standard. But the important thing is that it totally undercuts the provision in the Littleton Charter for a public hearing if one's made up their mind and said there's nothing that can be presented at a public hearing that's going to change my mind. Because at that point, the whole purpose of the public hearing is for you to consider that evidence and in making your decision. And so sometimes I've represented councils over my career, but I'll be in a meeting with a council member and a citizen, and the council member will say that. And I have to tell you, it makes the city attorney cringe, because it's just, okay, you've just now said that the whole purpose of the public hearing doesn't exist. Yes, Councilmember.
Just like when we talked about quasi-judicial, the point in time that it becomes part of the record, in this case that you just shared with us, when does that public hearing, when does the testimony become part of the public hearing? Again, coming back to, I might get an email on it. So is there a time? Is it when it gets on the agenda and you know it's on the agenda? When is it testimony versus I just had a conversation on?
The difference is where like an ordinance. All the testimony in the public hearing becomes part of the record when it's given. You may be getting inquiries from your constituents. And just like any elected official, you're going to respond to those. You're going to pay credence to those inquiries because it's not a quasi-judicial proceeding. Now, one of the things, again, that I caution you on is when your constituent is really trying to twist your arm for a vote. And it's, I want you to vote no, I want you to vote yes. That's where my recommendation is you say, I certainly understand all your concerns. I'm going to be taking those into account. But please remember that there's a public hearing and I have an obligation to consider all of the testimony before I make a decision.
Follow up on that. Are you asking if you need to then submit everything for record? Because it's not a quasi-judicial study.
For ordinances and that, you don't have to have that included in the record because it is a legislative matter where you're actually allowed to consider things outside the record.
But a good practice would be, thank you for sharing your concerns with me. Please share them with other council members. Please come to the public hearing. Please send an email so that their voices.
I certainly recommend that because, again, what tends to happen sometimes is you can get situations where a person will approach one council member who may not even represent that district. And again, you work as a body. So if one council member is kind of seen as getting involved in another council member's district, you can create situations where the substance, which may be really important, gets lost. And so I certainly recommend that it's appropriate. There's nothing that would prohibit you from saying, thank you, Ms. Smith, I appreciate your concerns, and I will be sharing them with the whole council so that all of the councils are aware of them. And again, because it's a rational basis standard, you give those concerns, each of you, however much credence you think that they're worth. You may say, well, I think Ms. Smith is just completely off the wall. I'm not giving her concerns any credence. Or you may say, well, no, Ms. Smith makes a lot of sense, and I'm going to give her concerns. They really click with me, and that's may lead me to how I'm going to vote. And that's perfectly proper in a legislative matter. Now, every so often, you haven't had it recently, but once in a great while, you will act in a regulatory way. And this is a regulatory. What is that? Well, every so often, you act as a reviewing body of an agency decision. And when you act in that capacity, it's not quasi-judicial, but the evidentiary standard is a much different standard than any other time you act. And whenever this happens, I will be talking to you in great detail, because the evidentiary standard is two things. You are, A, to defer to the expertise of the agency. So if you're acting in a regulatory capacity, and a good example of that is an appeal of a final plat that may be decided by the Community Development Department. When you're acting in that, you first defer to the agency, and unless you have evidence in the record that the agency is wrong, you give deference to their decision. And secondly, the standard is what we call arbitrary, unreasonable, and capricious, which is, again, three fancy legal words. What does it mean in plain English? Arbitrary means unthinking, that you simply gave it no thought. Unreasonable means that a reasonable person could not come to that conclusion. And capricious means you simply ignored the whole record and just did what you wanted. And it's very rare that the council will act in a regulatory capacity, but once in a while you will, and certainly in those situations, council communication is going to say, you're acting tonight in a regulatory capacity, here's the standards. And one of the things I like to make sure with the staff communications, and the staff's been really good about this, is when we have things that are quasi-judicial, we say in the council communication, quasi-judicial. And if we have things that are regulatory, we say that. Because I think, A, we as a staff owe that to you, and B, this telegraphs to you, okay, this is the thought process I need to have when I'm approaching this.
One of the things that we have done, and maybe we need to make it just that we all agree that we will continue to do it or do it differently, is that when we do get emails, particularly for quasi-judicial, but it could also apply to public hearings, and we, to Karina's point, want to share, think that the rest of council should, what we have been doing is just sending them to Wendy, and then Wendy creates a packet of that information. We had talked about this when we talked about the protocols, that 5 o'clock was the shut off, and I think we changed that to 3 or 4.
I believe you changed it to 4.
To 4. And so the date of the hearing, at 4 o'clock, anything that comes in after 4 would not be considered part of the record because we have to have time to prepare and get it to council. But if I get an email and I send it to Wendy at 3 o'clock, it shows up, and all of you may have done the same thing with yours. It will show up at our desk, hopefully in our email before the meeting, but also then the night of the meeting there, and that would be considered part of the record in part. So then we would have that share and that evenness, and that could work for both. And maybe what we can do too is on the occasion that we do have that happen, and we may have 10 or 12 pages, which has happened, is that we can take a 10-minute recess for council to read that, so that there is because sometimes
Totally
impulses are ignored if we haven't, so we don't want to do that. So that may be something and that way then we know that everybody has received that email.
Will that be something that you would write into this?
Well, I think what we can just do is we can write that as part of the council protocols. What I'd recommend is we keep the quasi-judicial rules solely for quasi-judicial, but we'll integrate that with council's.
Let's just detail that in the protocols, because I don't think we.
What you just said isn't quasi-judicial, that's for a regular ordinance.
It would be for quasi-judicial
As
too.
well, yeah.
Yes. And
It would be for both, any public hearing.
Well, we're not supposed to have ex parte communication. If you're getting an email, that's ex parte communication then. But if.
It's shared with.
You're sharing it. Right. Yeah.
We're giving it to Wendy and it goes to the record,
okay.
and then we can read it at the hearing.
Mayor,
And
Council,
everybody's.
if you'd like, I'll work with Mark and Wendy on how we integrate that into our policies and procedures, so we cover that. But I would, if it's agreeable with council, I would ask your direction that I bring this back to you by resolution for adoption as a formal set of rules for quasi-judicial proceedings for both the council and those boards and commissions that exercise quasi-judicial authority.
Okay, let me just ask, I have one question for you.
Sure.
And then, so a number of cities, during a quasi-judicial public hearing, prior to any testimony, including applicants, staff and applicant, asks anybody who will be speaking in front of council to rise, and then they are sworn in. So there is a kind of a legality to that. Is that necessary? Is that something, I mean, it's obviously not mandatory, but what are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are is that if you can certainly do that, it's not required in Colorado for a quasi-proceeding that you swear people in. If this was a regular court proceeding, then it would be, but it's not required. But there are cities in Colorado that do that. Now, one of the benefits of that, I think, there is a benefit to it, which is that it forces people to think about what they say, because when you raise your right hand and you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, and it suddenly makes people think, I need to make sure what I'm saying is really true, because I've just sworn or affirmed that everything I'm about to say is true. And there's no problem with councils doing that. Some cities do. There's a number of cities, I checked a number of cities when I wrote these rules, and I looked all over the state. Now, interestingly enough, this is a problem that cities all over the state are having, because a number of cities are saying, oh, well, if your council adopts rules, please send them to us, because we need to do the same thing, and we're having the same problem. And, but I think you certainly could do that. If that's something that council wants to do, I will incorporate it in this draft before it comes to you by resolution.
Council?
Question on the disclosing that we make a site visit. That affects not only council, but several of the boards and commissions. So elaborate on that a little bit. So if I go out and I see a property, because that's we're going to discuss something, I have to disclose versus not disclose? I mean, if I don't go there, do I say I didn't go there? Or
no,
when I go there, I have to disclose I did go there?
Well, our recommendation is, because that is evidence, that if you go out and do a site visit, you simply disclose at the beginning. In fact, this happened at the last planning commission meeting on Monday. A number of people indicated, yes, I went to the site, I didn't talk to anybody, but I did tour the site, and I'd like that incorporated in the record. And that's all that's said.
And the planning commission is doing that.
And they're doing that. That's our recommendation, is that if you do a site visit, you simply disclose that fact and put it in the record. Now, I would caution you, please don't do site visits and then proceed to talk to the applicant. That's not a good thing. But if you do a site visit, now, we have to be honest about something here, too. We all live in this community. Most of the places that you're going to have rezoning cases on, you probably drive by. And you can't close your mind and close your eyes as you drive.
Close your eyes.
So you are going to have some personal knowledge. And that's true as judges. I've tried cases in front of judges, and they have personal knowledge about something because they live there. And they're not required to somehow cleanse their minds. But if that same judge went out and did a site visit, then he would have, or she would have to disclose that, because that would be viewed as something that should be in the record.
The site visit is going after the application has been filed, going for the specific purpose of reviewing it for the...
For your action on the application.
To say I was there 8 years ago one time.
So council, is there any objections to doing a swearing in, or how do you guys feel about that?
I think licensing authority does that.
Licensing does?
I believe, I can't remember which.
Licensing, does licensing do
Licensing board does that, and so certainly it's well within the council's prerogative, and I'd be happy to include that.
So this is anybody that gets up and goes to the dais?
You would
to the
do
podium?
it prior. You would not do it one at a time.
For anybody that goes to speak at the podium?
You ask me, I'm going to speak in front of council, please stand.
Okay,
and then they all get sworn in at the same time.
And then if they later decide they want to talk, they weren't a part of that first group, then they'd be sworn in?
Then if they later decided, and they were not sworn in initially, yes, what I would recommend then is the presiding officer would say, have you been sworn? No. Please raise your right hand, and I will give the presiding officer the swearing in script, so to speak.
Yeah.
So I think licensing doesn't
It could get a little cumbersome there. Does that include members of the public?
If they're giving testimony at the public hearing on a quasi-judicial, yes. They're witnesses. No different than a court proceeding. If you're in a court proceeding and you give testimony, the first thing you do before you sit down in the box is the judge's clerk will say, please raise your right hand to be sworn. And witnesses in a public hearing on a quasi-judicial matter, they are literally doing the same thing. They're giving testimony in a judicial matter.
And staff?
And now, normally, very few cities require staff to be sworn. If you really want staff to be sworn, I think it's certainly your prerogative. In most cities, staff is not required to be sworn. But if you want them to be, I don't see any problem with that at all.
So there's the applicant, there's staff, and there's the public.
Who's testifying on the
Who are
matter.
testifying. So to me, if we're asking one group to be sworn in, then we should be asking all.
I think you can do that.
I mean, just like we've
How about
been
the
sworn in.
intervener is mentioned in this?
Great word.
What that is once in a great while, there's only a few cases that we have this, but we do have quasi-judicial boards where a third party is given a specific legal right to intervene. They are an intervener. It doesn't happen very much, but a good example would be that in some building board of appeals matters, a third party, like a mortgage company, may have a right to intervene if we're doing an order for destruction of a building. And they actually have a right to participate in the building. It doesn't happen very often. But if it does, then they actually are a party, and the same rules that apply to the applicant and to the council would apply to them as well.
Let's swear them all in.
Well, and it would be, everybody would rise at the same time and be sworn in together. And I don't think there's a downside to it. I just don't, what does council think? You guys, is it something you want to do or you not want to do? You okay? Peggy?
I'm a little bit on the fence. I just feel like it becomes, what we're trying to do is really engage anyone and create a welcoming environment that feels very intimidating. I don't know, what's it adding? I guess I'm struggling with the added value at this point. Again, we know, and you've clearly told us, our responsibility is to take testimony that's factually based. So we're already acting as the information, yes, we are trusting. We are trusting that the information that's being presented is factual, or we have information that can say, no, I know the accurate information, or I can go to staff or legal counsel to say, and we can ask the question, can you verify that point that was made? So for me, I just feel it might be intimidating, and kind of push that engagement. So I don't know that it's necessary.
I'm fine with it.
Jerry?
I'm with Corinne. I just don't understand why. I mean, have we had any issues? But
I don't think it's because there's been any issues. I think it's
part of it's intimidating enough getting down to that podium.
That is true.
And add something else to it. I'm on the fence. I just haven't given it any thought, and give me 30 seconds, 60 seconds to think about it.
Oh, we don't have to make a decision tonight. Yeah. We can amend these if we need to.
You can amend these at any time. If council wants to think about that, I can certainly take the direction to bring these forth. Without that, then if council said, you could even entertain an amendment that night if council decides that's the approach it wants to take.
Well, and just to clarify on that too, the intention isn't to do, to intimidate, or the intention really is, and this would only be a quasi-judicial, this would be my recommendation. The intention really is to just raise the bar in the room for these, because oftentimes, like in a quasi-judicial, particularly if it's a zoning issue, or we've had a number of them that can get that there's two sides. I mean, people are engaged in this, and there's passion, and I think what it does is it just helps raise the level of importance as to why we're here, what this is about. This really is a judicial measure that's being taken. This is a policy-making thing that's at a bigger scale. And so without trying to intimidate, which is absolutely not what we want to do, because you're right, I mean, it's can be that room. But does it have a benefit to bringing the conversation or bringing that up to that importance level? Peggy, you had a...
Yeah, I don't know that we've had this happen, but I certainly could see that it could happen. That someone would have reason to not be telling the truth and something. And anybody who comes to speak is saying they're telling the truth. We're saying that we're telling the truth, and that we're going to be objective. So I think it's a question of how the whole, I want to say affair, but that's not a good word, how the whole thing is handled is more important than that one little piece that somebody is saying, I'm telling the truth here. Because to not say it leaves the possibility that some unscrupulous dude is not going to tell the truth because has a secret interest that nobody knows about.
Well, I also think that by not doing it, we're not assuming that people are, or by doing it, that we're assuming people would lie if we didn't do it. I think we have to. People can swear in and still lie. I mean, we do it all the time. So it doesn't stop someone for not telling the truth.
Well, all they're doing is swearing that what they think is true in their own mind. It doesn't mean it's true.
And it's really just a matter of just kind of, like I said, just elevating the conversation at a quasi-judicial where it really is at the highest level of policymaking that we do.
How about we think about it for a while?
Yeah, I think that's fine. Just kind of mull it over. It's not, we've been going years without it. It's just, and I'm not pushing for it at all. It's just an idea, and other municipalities do it, and they like it. So, but you want us to bless this and have you bring it back. Is there anyone that would object?
No, I do have an issue. I want another, it's a minor one.
Okay, then Kyle next.
On page 3F3, it says, if the applicant has attachments, PowerPoints, or materials, they should be provided to the clerk for inclusion into the record unless there is an objection to their inclusion in the record. Who gets to object?
Only the opposing party. So if an applicant brings an
So I think that should be in there saying, because sometimes citizens have objected to something, and I'm not faulting citizens for doing it, but if we don't spell out who gets to object, somebody surely has the right to do it.
I'd be happy to add in that unless there's an objection from another party to their inclusion in the record, because the only people who are able to object is another party. And then the presiding officer is the one who would rule on that objection. And if you've watched any type of show on TV, objections, and usually in these proceedings we don't have, most presiding officers don't allow what lawyers call, in a fancy term, objections as to form and how the testimony comes out. They really only allow and deal with objections as to substance. And if someone introduces a PowerPoint in the last minute that was never part of the record, a presiding officer might well say, I'm going to grant the objection. This was never, the other party didn't see it. They just walked in and stuck it into the computer. And that would be a very legitimate grounds to grant the objection and deny that exhibit being considered. But I would add in that language an objection from any other party.
Under F1, we've got the 5 o'clock thing in there.
Right, not 4.
That needs to change. On page 3.
Page 3?
F1.
Yeah, that's
Oh,
what.
yes. We'll change that to 4 o'clock in light of your change that you've made to the protocols.
Okay. Anybody have an objection to having us back up?
So both of the 5 o'clocks in there get changed.
There's 3 of them.
I'll make that 4 o'clock based on the action you took in regards to the protocols.
Kyle, did you have a question?
This question was just about the swearing in. Would that provide us any is there a legal benefit if there was an appeal?
Yeah.
That said, someone said, oh, I appeal this because so-and-so was lying to you. Would that provide us any?
That is really not, I mean, to appeal a quasi-judicial decision of the council under Rule 106, it isn't so much you can't really appeal based on the weight of the testimony. What you're going to have to appeal is you're going to have to argue that the council somehow, as a judge, acted outside of their authority or engaged in a significant error of for example, the council in looking at a rezoning failed to follow the rules set forth in its own code and general comprehensive plan. And then a court would say, well, wait a second, the comprehensive plan of the city says that the council will find these factors in a rezoning case. The council neglected to do so, so as a matter of law, we're going to find that the council acted inappropriately and send the case back to the council for rehearing.
Thank you. Okay. So we're ready to go? Steve?
I have my direction.
You got your directions?
Can I just ask that when this gets presented to us, you know, we have this now, we have the protocols and all, so can we just do it all in one night so we're having the same conversation and everything's interrelated?
I am happy to do that. If the mayor is okay, I'll just go right to the city attorney update.
Yeah.
And we have the, Mark and I have been working on the protocols. We should have those done either at the end of this week or early next week. And basically, he and I are doing one consolidated draft versus giving you an attorney piece and a manager piece, which then makes it, you're having all these drafts to review, so we're going to do a single consolidated draft. And we will have those done shortly on the protocols with the various areas that Kathy Novak addressed. And then I've addressed the confidentiality and a couple of the other items that you asked me to address. Mark's addressing his, and it will come to you in one draft in red line form as a Word document that you can look at.
Yeah, so on this 1C, I had a couple of typos and little
Okay, you can
things.
go offline with
I'm happy to get with you, Councilmember, and I also love English teachers and English professors. They were my favorite professors in college. So.
All right, whatever.
Once you're hit, you don't hit it.
So now, city attorney and city manager updates, and I know that, Mark, you have a couple updates that you wanted to.
Yes, I think we had a request here from,
Yeah, Councilmember Elrod.
yes, just for me to demonstrate a little bit about how we're communicating some of the fire issue to date, and specifically on our webpage. So I'm going to ask Sam here just to, obviously at this point in time, it's more just trying to provide a little bit of information based on the conversations we've had with city council at study sessions. Don't want to be too presumptuous here, because obviously you got your public hearing, which we've had a fair amount of discussion about what that's all about here on April 17th. So we do have and Sam was going to demonstrate some of this. There's kind of a button right on the home page, so you can kind of hit on this. This is the web page we set up here some weeks ago. So we've been just adding to this a little bit over time. So it takes you right to that unification page. And you can see here we've put in our press release here that we've had recently. You can see some of the prior presentations off to the right. We do have a link to South Metro's page, because they're going to have a series of public hearings coming up here, assuming that the council's action may be here on the 17th. We got some of our previous presentations. We do have a unification fact sheet. Pull that up real quick if you would, Sam. Okay, so this is something that we've developed here, and part of it you've seen in the graphics here in previous study sessions, but this is trying to consolidate, some of the points that we've been making here you've seen this here certainly in the retreat and then subsequent presentations. So this is, again, basically summarizing a lot of that information here that we've been having here in the last couple of months. Yes?
Is there a way we can call out Meadowbrook and Lockheed Martin so that's...
We sure could. Okay. We sure could. And again, this is based on the conversations to date, so this likely will change here, again, depending on your action on the 17th. If you might back out a little bit back to that unification page, Off to the right, we're starting to get some letters here from other governmental agencies here. It'll be part of the record here, part of the packet, kind of in support of this process. So we're kind of listing all those as we get them. Let's see, we do have an FAQ. Where's that at?
It's right over here.
Oh, I see. All right. Okay. So, we're starting to get some questions, and we talked a little bit about this at the study session. So we have invited people, to send those questions to us. Council got that here late today.
Good, it was good.
Yeah. So, we're trying to respond to those, and so we're simply just going to put a lot of those up here as they become new. If we see repeats, obviously we're not going to add that, but this is something we'll just have to work on over time.
When did these pieces all go up? Because some of this information looks new to me.
Well, like that, it's brand new. That we got this afternoon.
That's today. So the fact sheet?
Questions?
The FAQs are brand new.
No, the fact sheet. The fact sheet.
Yes, this one.
That's new too?
That's new as well. And, some of again, it's trying to rely on some of the graphics that we've done here just in the last couple of study sessions.
So Stephen, in lieu of what you said earlier, do we have to say, hey, and by the way, I went and looked at this?
No, I mean, in a public hearing, you can certainly look at this. What I would ask that you do is, because it is a public hearing, that you simply keep your mind open. I would ask that you not go and say, oh, I looked at this, and by the way, having read these questions, I'm going to vote X or Y. No, I've looked at this. I certainly have some opinions about this, but I'm not going to make a decision on the testimony at the public hearing, and then I'll make my decision.
Because it's not quasi-judicial.
But I read Sam's email.
Yes.
The whole thing,
Yes.
so I don't have to reference that. Oh, by the way, I read that.
No, you don't have to reference that.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. It's not quasi-judicial.
That's
So you don't have to reference it. That this is just relevant information that you're considering in the decision you're going to make. And you'll give it whatever weight you choose to give it.
Got it.
Have a complete rundown of everything you did during the day.
That's what I'm wondering.
I want to know it all. Mark, you mentioned that you're encouraging, if citizens have questions, you're encouraging them to ask you those questions. So is there a button if you have any questions, or is it whatever filters through us, whatever filters through you?
I think that's a piece that we need to develop here, to be honest with you. I think we do need to make it real easy so if they want to submit questions from this page, they can do that. We do have some other pieces where there's a feedback button, I guess, specifically, but we want to make this about as easy as we can for people and obvious. One of the other things we're working on is a timeline too, so that people understand where we've been historically with this. And we've, again, talked about this at length. The issue really goes back decades, but most of the recent action really started probably, mid last year, fall. And so I think we want to highlight some of the more important milestones. We'll also hit this in the presentation on the 17th, but, I think we're starting to get questions about how did we get here, and which is obviously very legitimate. So we want to try to start answering that the best we can now to help inform people.
So the feedback button does allow people to give feedback. It's just kind of hidden.
Yeah, it's not real pronounced there.
It's not very, I think it'd be better if there was something that was easier to see.
Arrows pointing to it or something, I don't know. But
So I can't digest all that quickly. So I didn't notice, although it might be there. Are there no reasons, even little ones, not to unify?
Not to. This is, we haven't really gotten to that point in the kind of the discussion here. There are materials there that we shared about what we've contrasted, and this is just reflecting the study sessions. So there's no kind of pro-con statement as part of this. That'll be part of this formal staff communication. It's not part of the webpage, not today.
But there could be something for like citizens opposed or something like that.
We could do lots of things here, and we're just trying to provide information the best we can today. And I think we all have to acknowledge that the timeline we're under is quite honestly forced upon us. Our partners made some decisions here last fall, and now we're trying to respond to that. And so, I think we're doing our best here to try to provide as much of that information as the council has discussed it. Again, I'm not trying to be too presumptuous on this issue. I'm trying to reflect your discussion. So I'm not trying to get in front of the council here. So I'm trying to be delicate with that.
I think that's great.
It's a good,
And
maybe a
I
good
love
start.
that it has that fire rescue unification run on the front page as a button, so it's,
Just in case anyone missed it, it's right here.
Yeah, we've used that bar traditionally for these kinds of things. And so from time to time, we'll move things up to the front page like that.
Great. Anything else?
Let's see. Was there something else? I can't remember. I can't think of it.
I had also asked Steve there was some questions from Carol on quasi judicial. I think we addressed a lot of them in what you shared with us tonight.
Yes, yeah. I did, and I tried to keep my answers very, very short.
You didn't succeed.
I thought you did great. I thought you did great. I thought you
No, I meant an email. I meant the email.
Oh.
Yes.
Yeah, the email.
Oh, with the abbreviated.
They were bold and not all caps.
Yeah, that was good.
Okay, if there's nothing else,
Yeah, we're done.
we're adjourned.